All right, I'd like to call to order the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission's Winter 2022 Striped Bass Management Board. And today, first of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marty Gary. I'm with the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. I'm the incoming chair. This will be my first meeting. Previously, David Borden served through October of last year. Our vice chair is currently vacant. We'll be addressing that vacancy at the May board meeting. Our technical committee chair is Kevin Sullivan from New Hampshire. Our advisory panel chair is Lou Bassano from New Jersey. Our law enforcement committee representative is Kurt Blanchard from Rhode Island. And previously, this board met on October 20th of 2021. So first order of business is to go to, and actually before we do that, I want to take a moment to provide some gratitude and thanks to the outgoing chair, David Borden. David served through October of this past year, 2021, and had to navigate a labyrinth of meetings and the logistics associated with them, the work group that met in the summer of 2020. It was a tremendous amount of work. And David, we just want to thank you for your leadership and all your hard work that went into that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome, David. It was great work. And you have gotten us tantalizingly close with this amendment. So hopefully we'll be able to get that through this meeting and out to public comment. The public has been very patient waiting for this. And one other item I wanted to hit, we have a dynamic board. It changes a lot, and there's one name that I'm not familiar with, and maybe it's a mistake, but Jesse Hornstein. Jesse, I don't think I've met you personally, but and maybe somebody else has already welcomed you through the other boards, but welcome to the Striped Bass Board. You are, as I understand, you're representing you're the administrative proxy for James Gilmore. So welcome, Jesse.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll go ahead and move into the agenda. The first order of business is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes, modifications to the agenda as it's been presented today?
I have no hands, Marty.
Thank you, Tony. And so the agenda is approved by consent. Next up is the approval of the proceedings from October 2021. Are there any modifications to the last meeting of this board in October 2021?
I have no hands.
Thanks, Tony. So that approval of those proceedings is also approved through consent. Next up, number 3 on our agenda is public comment. This is for issues that are not on our agenda today. So I'd ask those individuals that would like to make comment for these items that aren't part of our agenda, if they could raise their hand now. And Tony, if you could just let me know how many we have so we can budget time appropriately.
Thanks, Marty. I'm just giving it a second to let hands get up. Phil, I see that your hand is up, but you are not connected to the audio, so I can't unmute you. I don't, and hopefully you got the message about who you can call to help get you connected. I don't know what else to do there, Marty. And that's the only hand we have.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping that if there are other items that Phil would like to comment on, it is my intention, if there's any modifications to the items that are being presented today that we'll be getting to fairly shortly, whether it's an addition, a deletion, or a modification, there'll be an opportunity. So that maybe there's a way Mr. Zalsak can still provide his thoughts. All right, so the only other item I want to discuss before we go into the next item, which is considered draft amendment 7 for public comment, is my status as chair. I think most of you know that PRFC does not have a delegation. I'm the sole representative for the agency. As such, I'm going to be voting today. I did discuss this with Bob and Tony, and so that is discretion that I have that I can exercise. So it is my intention. I just want to go on the record as saying I will be voting for PRFC today. And with that, we'll go to item number 4, consideration of draft amendment 7 for public comment. And I'll turn it over to Emily, but I'll just let everybody know our primary objective today is to take the document, and for those items that Emily's going to be presenting, our mission here today, our objective is to, we can either leave items in the document, we can remove them, we can modify them, or we could add something. And it would be my intention to, time permitting, provide the public comment if any modification, addition, or deletion were to occur. So Emily, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll start this item number 4, consider draft amendment 7 for public comment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Just going to get my presentation all set up here. All right. So I'll go ahead and get this presentation started. Again, thanks so much, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, I will be presenting an overview of Striped Bass Draft Amendment 7 today for the board's consideration. So here's just an outline of the presentation today. I'll start with a brief background on the amendment and the timeline, and then I'll transition to reviewing the proposed options with a focus today on the new options that have been added or modified since the October board meeting. And those new options are in the management trigger section, the measures to protect strong year classes section, and the rebuilding plan section. And then throughout the presentation today, I'll note comments from the advisory panel on those new options. And then I'll conclude today with reviewing the remaining options in the recreational release mortality and the conservation equivalency sections. And then as part of that recreational release mortality review, I'll also review some discussion from the law enforcement committee from their winter webinar. And then finally, similar to the previous board meeting in October, I'll pause for board questions and discussions after 1 or 2 sections. And as Marty mentioned, the board action for consideration today is to consider approval of draft amendment 7 for public comment. So first, I'd like to thank the plan development team for their time developing this draft document and working through all these options. We've had several more meetings since the October board meeting. So again, I want to thank them for their time. I also want to thank the technical committee for providing the projections for the year class section that I'll review during this presentation. So starting with a brief recap of the background on Amendment 7, since Amendment 6 was adopted in 2003, the status of the striped bass stock and fishery has changed considerably. And the results of the 2018 benchmark stock assessment in particular led the board to discuss a number of issues facing striped bass management. And that assessment indicated the stock has been overfished since 2013 and is experiencing overfishing. In August of 2020, the board initiated the development of Amendment 7 to update the management program to better align with current fishery priorities and to build on the Addendum 6 action to initiate stock rebuilding. In May of last year, following the public comment period on the public information document, or PID, the board approved 4 issues for development in the draft amendment. And those issues are management triggers, measures to protect the 2015 year class, which was initially focused on the ocean recreational fishery, recreational release mortality, and conservation equivalency. At the October 2021 board meeting, the board did discuss draft amendment 7 and the proposed options that were presented. And the board decided to remove some of the draft options due to concerns about viability for implementation. So those removed options are no longer in the draft amendment that was provided to you for review today. Also, at the October meeting, the board tasked the plan development team with developing additional options to add to the draft for the board to review today at the winter meeting. So those additional options that have been added were an additional option for the fishing mortality threshold trigger, options to consider low recruitment in the rebuilding calculations and rebuilding plan, and then options for Chesapeake Bay recreational measures to protect strong year classes. So since the October board meeting, as I mentioned, the plan development team has met via webinar several times to develop these new options. In addition to the new options, the PDT has also modified some of the other options in the draft amendment, and those modifications were explained in the memo from the PDT that was included in the meeting materials. And then finally, the PDT also updated the amendment with clarifying edits as needed throughout the draft. So here is the current timeline for Amendment 7. So as I mentioned, following the PID process, which wrapped up in May, the PDT has been developing the draft amendment based on direction from the board, including the changes made by the board at the October 2021 meeting. So currently we are here in January 2022 for the board to consider approving the draft amendment for public comment. If the draft is approved for public comment today, the public comment period would take place from February through April, and the final amendment could be approved potentially in May of this year. And as a reminder, the next stock assessment update is expected later this year in October. So just a couple of reminders on implementation timeline for Amendment 7. So the implementation timeline will be determined by the board during final approval of the draft amendment. So this includes setting a deadline for states to submit implementation plans and a deadline for implementation, and those will be specified in Section 5.2, which is the compliance schedule. Draft Amendment 7, as we all know, includes options for several different provisions, which could have different implementation timelines. So for example, any new management measures that would require states to change their regulations. So for example, measures to address recreational release mortality would likely be implemented in 2023 to allow time to make those regulatory changes. On the other hand, management triggers are typically implemented immediately upon approval of the amendment. And so those new triggers would be evaluated during the 2022 assessment update later this year. The board could specify a different implementation timeline if needed for the management triggers, for example, if any state's regulations were tied to those triggers. Listed here on this slide are an outline of the components of the draft amendment document. Section 1 includes statement of the problem, benefits of implementation, habitat considerations. Section 2 includes the history of management, goals and objectives, description of the management unit, reference points, and stock rebuilding program. Section 3 of the amendment specifies monitoring program information, including catch and landings data, biological data, and also an overview of the stock assessment process. Section 4 is the management program and proposed options section, which includes all the proposed options that I'll be reviewing today. Those are options for management triggers, recreational measures, the rebuilding plan, and conservation equivalency. Section 4 does also include the adaptive management section. And then continuing on, Section 5 is the compliance section, and that includes all the mandatory compliance elements and outlines the compliance reports and those procedures. Section 6 describes management and research needs, and Section 7 reviews potential interactions with protected species. So for the rest of my presentation today, I'll transition to reviewing the proposed options in the draft amendment. Again, starting with those new options that have been added since the October board meeting. So I'll start with management triggers, followed by measures to protect strong year classes and the rebuilding plan section. And then, as I mentioned, I'll wrap up with the recreational release mortality and conservation equivalency section. And I'll pause after one or two sections for questions or discussion from the board. And then, as Mr. Chair mentioned earlier, just as a reminder, today the board could modify the proposed options if desired, and the board could consider approving this draft amendment for public comment. And throughout my presentation, I mentioned I'll be including the advisory panel comments. So the advisory panel met in January to provide feedback on the scope of the new proposed options that were added since October. So I'll include those comments throughout my slides today. And the full AP summary was included in the supplemental materials for the meeting. And in addition, the Law Enforcement Committee met via webinar in December and briefly discussed the proposed options to address recreational release mortality, and their input will also be included in my presentation today. So moving into the proposed options, the first section for review is section 4.1, which is the management triggers. The statement of the problem for this issue outlines some of the concerns with how the current management triggers are designed. And those concerns include that when spawning stock biomass is below the target, the variable nature of fishing mortality from year to year can result in a continued need for management action. In addition, the shorter timetables for corrective action as required through the triggers are in conflict with the board's desire for management stability. The board has also been criticized for considering changes to management before the stock has had a chance to respond to previous management changes. The use of point estimates for management triggers does not account for an inherent level of uncertainty, and that was identified as a potential concern. And then finally, the long periods of below average recruitment in recent years has raised questions about the recruitment trigger. So the PDT divided the trigger options into 4 tiers. The first tier outlines the fishing mortality trigger options. The second tier outlines the female spawning stock biomass trigger options. The third tier outlines the recruitment trigger options, and the fourth tier outlines options for deferred management action. So within each tier is a set of primary options and sub-options to consider. And this framework is designed to allow the board and the public to consider each of the triggers individually. One note from staff is that language will be added to the draft amendment, noting that during stock assessment years, the recruitment trigger should be evaluated concurrently when possible with the fishing mortality and spawning stock biomass triggers at the time the assessment results are presented. So for example, stock assessment updates are typically presented to the board at the annual meeting in October. So during those assessment years, the board would evaluate the recruitment trigger at the October meeting as well. And this would ensure that the board has the best available information on the stock when evaluating all the triggers. Staff does recognize that evaluating the recruitment trigger at the same time as the fishing mortality and spawning stock biomass triggers may not always be possible during benchmark assessment years. The timing of benchmark assessments can be variable, but when it is possible, all the triggers should be evaluated at the same time during stock assessment years. So moving into tier 1, which are the fishing mortality triggers. The first set of options is option A, the timeline to reduce fishing mortality to the target. So when one of the fishing mortality triggers is tripped, sub-option A1 would require reducing F to the target within 1 year. That is the status quo. Sub-option A2 would require reducing F to the target within 2 years. Option B is the fishing mortality threshold trigger. If this trigger is tripped, the board must reduce F to the target per the timeline selected in the options that I just described in option A. So B1 is the status quo option where the trigger is tripped if F exceeds the threshold for 1 year. Sub-option B2 is a new option that was added by the board based on the October board meeting that would trip if the 2-year average of F exceeds the F threshold. And then sub-option B3, the trigger would be tripped if the 3-year average of F exceeds the threshold. So as I mentioned, at the October meeting, the board discussed the concern about averaging F rates from different management actions. And the PDT clarified in the draft amendment that for these multi-year average trigger options, sub-options B2 and B3, the average should not include data under different management actions. So the trigger would not be evaluated unless there are enough years of data to average under the most recent management action. So, for example, the stock assessment this year will include 2 years of data under Addendum 6. Those 2 years of fishing mortality could be averaged under suboption B2. However, if suboption B3 was selected, that trigger could not be evaluated because there wouldn't be 3 years of data available to evaluate. From the advisory panel perspective, some AP members did support considering these multi-year average options during the public comment period to address some concerns about uncertainty around MRIP and variability of F. Another AP member noted concern about the multi-year average options and concern about having to wait 2 or 3 years for enough data before taking action to reduce F. Moving on to option C, this is the fishing mortality target trigger. If this trigger is tripped, the board must reduce F to the target, again, per the timeline selected in option A. C1 is the status quo option where the trigger trips if F exceeds the target for 2 years and if spawning stock biomass is below the target in either year. C2 would trip if F exceeds the target for 3 consecutive years. And C3 would eliminate the trigger related to F target. Moving on to tier 2, which are the female spawning stock biomass triggers. Again, there are 3 sets of options for the board to consider. Option A considers the deadline to implement a rebuilding plan when a spawning stock biomass trigger is tripped, which requires rebuilding within 10 years. So the status quo option A1 is no deadline for when a rebuilding plan must be implemented. A2 would require the board to implement a rebuilding plan within 2 years from when that trigger is tripped. Continuing on to option B, which is the spawning stock biomass threshold trigger. B1 is the status quo option where the trigger is tripped if SSB is less than the threshold for 1 year. Suboption B2 would eliminate that trigger related to the spawning stock biomass threshold. Option C is the spawning stock biomass target trigger. C1 is the status quo option where the trigger trips if SSB is less than the target for 2 consecutive years and if F is above the target in either year. C2 would trip if SSB is below the target for 3 consecutive years. And then C3 would eliminate a trigger related to the SSB target. And again, it's important to note that there must be at least one SSB trigger, so the board could not eliminate both the SSB target and the SSB threshold triggers. So moving on to tier 3, which is the recruitment trigger. The first component to consider for the recruitment trigger is the definition of the trigger itself. So the status quo trigger A1 was designed to identify true recruitment failure, and this trigger would trip if any of the 6 juvenile abundance indices are below the 25th percentile of their established reference period for 3 consecutive years. So as requested by the board, the recruitment trigger alternatives developed by the technical committee, options A2 and A3 here, would be more sensitive than the status quo trigger. So these sub-options A2 and A3 would change the trigger reference period to 1992 to 2006. And this was identified as a period of high recruitment, and this results in more sensitive trigger options. So sub-option A2 would have a moderate sensitivity, and that would trip if any of the 4 core juvenile abundance indices, and so those are the 4 juvenile abundance indices that are used in the stock assessment, are below the 25th percentile from 1992 to 2006 for 3 consecutive years. Sub-option A3 would have a higher sensitivity and would trip if any of the 4 core juvenile abundance indices is below the median from 1992 to 2006 for 3 consecutive years. So again, there's that hierarchy of the status quo moving to the moderate sensitivity and then the higher sensitivity options. So the second component of the recruitment trigger is the management response. The status quo option B1 requires the board to review the cause of recruitment failure and determine the appropriate action if the trigger is tripped. For the alternatives here, the PDT removed a previous alternative that would have initiated stock rebuilding. After further discussion after the October board meeting, the PDT noted that stock rebuilding is a more appropriate response to the SSB triggers and not to the recruitment trigger. In addition to that modification, the PDT did modify sub-options B2 and B3, which are both intended to reduce fishing pressure as those weak year classes enter the population. So both sub-options B2 and B3 are based on calculating interim F reference points using a low recruitment assumption. However, these sub-options are slightly different in determining when action would be required to reduce F. So the PDT noted in the memo for today that the PDT recommends the board consider whether one of the approaches that I'll present on the next slide, B2 or B3, if one of those best aligns with what the board was intending for this recruitment trigger response. So starting with B2 on the left here, B2 would implement an interim F target calculated using the low recruitment assumption if the recruitment trigger is tripped. So then F in the terminal year would be compared to that lower F target. And if F in the terminal year is less than that interim F target, the board would need to reduce F within 1 year. On the right side, sub-option B3 would similarly use a low recruitment assumption to calculate an interim F target and would also calculate an interim F threshold. And then here's where these two options diverge. B3 would use those lower interim F reference points to reevaluate the fishing mortality triggers using those lower F reference points. So this option would go back to the definitions of the triggers that the board selected under tier 1 and plug in those new lower F target and F reference point, or F target and F threshold. And if one of those F-based triggers tripped during this reevaluation, then the board would be required to reduce F. So the difference here is a little bit subtle, but B2, which evaluates 1 point estimate of F against the target, is more conservative than B3, which uses the already defined triggers from tier 1. So again, if the board has any discussion on which of these approaches best aligns with the board's intent here, it might be helpful to consider. And then to wrap up this section, the final tier, tier 4, is the deferred management action section. Option A is the status quo option, which is no deferred management action. So that is, if a management trigger is tripped at any time, the board must take the required action. And the alternatives presented here would provide the board with the flexibility to defer action until the next stock assessment if certain criteria are met. And these options, again, were developed in response to the concern about the frequent need to make management changes. So option B would allow action to be deferred until the next assessment if it's been less than 3 years since the last action was taken responding to a management trigger. Option C would defer action until the next assessment if the F target trigger is tripped and SSB is above the target. Option D would defer action until the next assessment if the F target trigger is tripped and SSB is projected to increase or remain stable over the next 5 years. Option E would defer action if the F target trigger is tripped and there is at least a 75% probability that SSB will be above the threshold for the next 5 years. So that is looking at the probability of SSB being above the threshold in that 5th year. Previously, this option E required at least a 50% probability, but the PDT modified this option to require at least a 75% probability in order to increase the level of confidence when the board is considering deferring action. And then finally, option F would defer action until the next assessment if a management trigger trips after the board has already initiated action in response to a different trigger. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I have for management triggers, and I'm happy to take any questions or provide any more detail if needed.
Thank you, Emily. And as we decided up front, we're going to go through these sequentially. So thanks for the presentation on the management triggers. So we're now going to take questions from the board for Emily regarding any clarification you need. And then we're going to move into a discussion and consider any potential modification, removal, or additions. So questions for Emily, and I'll rely on Tony if you could. I'm not presenter, so if you could go ahead and queue up maintain the queue for questions, please.
Will do, Marty. Thank you, Mr. Chair. John McMurray is the only person with the hand up for now.
All right, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question regarding the F threshold trigger sub option B3, which is the 3-year average option, and particularly the subtext below B3, which says the 3-year average F should not include data under different management actions, i.e. the F threshold trigger should not be evaluated unless there are at least 3 years of data in the assessment under the most recent management action. So based on the frequency of assessments, which is generally every 2 years, and it's rarely more than that, and subsequent management actions that take place, this would appear to me to effectively limit the years of data available, and there would almost never be a time when there are at least 3 years of data in the assessment under the most recent management action. So am I interpreting that option right? Because it seems really unlikely that a threshold would ever be tripped under that option.
Thanks, John. You are interpreting that correctly in that the trigger couldn't be evaluated under option B3 unless there were 3 years of data available under the most recent management action. And the PDT wanted to provide the board with this range of average options. Again, considering an average threshold trigger here would be a way for the board to address concerns about variability. One of the things that was also noted in the amendment, which I did not note on the slide, is that the board isn't constrained by taking action only if the trigger trips. The board could take action at any time, but you are interpreting that correctly.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yep, go ahead, John. All yours.
Yeah. So theoretically, overfishing could continue, but because of the frequency of assessments, no management action would be required, correct?
Correct. If there are less than 3 years of data available, then the trigger couldn't be evaluated.
Okay, one more quick one, and then I'll cut it off if I can, Mr. Chairman. I haven't been around as long as a lot of you guys here, but has there ever been a time since Amendment 6 was implemented that the board did act without a management trigger being tripped?
Good question. I'm going to defer maybe to Tony or to potentially other board members on this one.
I'm going to defer that to Bob since he's been around since the approval of Amendment 6.
I guess the buck stopped here, Marty, if I can chime in.
Absolutely, Bob. Please do.
Yeah, John, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. I know that the board has reacted a number of times to stock assessment information, but I don't know if each time a management trigger was tripped when the board reacted, or if just the stock condition changed but did not trip one of the triggers. So I'd have to go back and look. I just don't recall. Sorry.
John, did that answer your, well, it didn't answer your question, I guess, but we'd have to get back. Sounds like we'd have to get back to you on it, but does that satisfy the range of questions you had for Emily and staff?
It does.
Okay, thank you. And Tony, has anybody else raised their hand?
Yeah, we have Mike Luisi followed by Justin Davis.
All right, Mike, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. So Emily, I just had a quick question for you related to a comparison of, let me see which tiers here. It's a comparison of the tier 1 options with the tier 4 options under deferred management. So under tier 1, there is an option C for F target triggers. And I'm not suggesting in any way that this would be the case, but if an F target trigger, if it was determined by the board that there was going to be more of a focus on threshold and less on an F target trigger under the tier 1 alternatives, does it eliminate options C, D, and E in the deferred management action since they are all related to the F target trigger? Or is there an opportunity then for that to default to what's selected from tier 1, of which trigger would, we would be using for fishing mortality?
Thanks,
Does that
Mike.
make sense? Yeah, I hope that makes sense. And it was jumping back and forth, but just want to be sure when I need to explain this to folks, whether or not if F target goes away, do we lose the options to defer management?
Yeah, so I understand your question, and that's a great question. The PDT did not talk about this scenario specifically, but we also did not talk about, if the F target trigger was eliminated, if C, D, and E would change. So I'm going to say that if the F target trigger is eliminated, C, D, and E would no longer be available as options.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. That's all I had.
Thank you, Mike. And Tony, did you say it was Justin was next in queue?
Correct.
Dr. Davis, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to return to the sub-option B3 under the F management trigger response. And I appreciate John bringing that up because I have the same concerns about whether this trigger would essentially be too conservative and wouldn't be tripped very often. I guess the idea that we would never have 3 years of data under consistent management sort of presumes that we would make a management change every time we get an assessment. But if I'm interpreting this correct, if the board received an assessment and decided not to take management action, either because the assessment results were very positive or a management trigger wasn't tripped, that would set the stage for, at the next assessment, us being able to have at least 3 years of data under consistent management, and therefore being able to evaluate this, F trigger B3. So I'm wondering if I'm interpreting that correct. And then the second question I have was that the board has the flexibility to request a stock assessment update sort of sooner than perhaps planned outside of the normal, kind of stock assessment rotation we typically do for this species. So if there was an instance where, we received the stock assessment, there were a couple troubling years of F, but we didn't have the 3 years under consistent management required, the board would have the latitude to request an update sooner than planned to allow sooner evaluation of that F trigger. Is that correct?
Correct. So you are interpreting that correctly in that, if an addendum were in place and, for a couple of years, and then another assessment comes along and the board decides not to change management, but rather to maintain management under that addendum, then at the next stock assessment, as you noted, there would be more than 3 years available for the board to consider with this potential B3 trigger. And as you mentioned, yes, the board can request a stock assessment at any time.
Mr. Chair, could I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure, Justin.
Thank you. The guidance about if sub-option B3 were selected, that management trigger should only be evaluated if there's 3 years of data under consistent management. That's a PDT recommendation. I mean, would it be possible when the board takes final action on this, if the board so chose, we could adopt option B3, but remove that sort of limiter that it has to be 3 years of data under the most recent action? And just my thought there is, I get the rationale for having it for 3 years under consistent management, but on some level, F is F. And if we, took a look after the assessment and had 3 years of F exceeding the threshold, even if that first year was under different management, perhaps it still would be appropriate to take action. So, I mean, could we potentially not put that guardrail in when the board takes final action if we selected this sub option.
Yes, the board could make that change to remove that guardrail, and that would mean that F is averaged for 3 years, regardless of whether those 3 years were under the same management action. From the PDT's perspective, the PDT's intent was not to average F under different management actions, but the board could make a decision to change that.
Does that answer your question, Justin?
Yeah, thank you, Emily.
All right, thank you, Justin. Tony, any other hands raised for questions?
Those are all the hands for now, Marty.
All right, thank you, Tony. So it sounds like we've gone through the question and answer component for this section. Is there a discussion about any modification? Sounds like there's an interest. Complexity level here is pretty high. There are some concerns we're all sensing. Does anyone want to go ahead and initiate a discussion? So go ahead and raise your hands. Tony will cue it again to see if we want to take any action to modify, remove any of these items.
Thanks, Marty. I have Megan Ware followed by John McMurray.
All right, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think along those lines of other people's concern about sub-option B3 and Tier 1, I would be open to a discussion on removing that option, and I sent staff a motion in case you'd like to operate via motions today.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Let me come back to you, but I'll reserve you first right to go ahead and make that motion. But I'll go to, did you have a follow to that or anything you wanted to add?
Well, I think a lot of what what has been said I would agree with, and just the practicality of that option I think is pretty limited. Looking forward, I'm not sure I see a time in the next decade where we might meet that 3-year mark. Obviously, we're going to be taking action in 2022 on an amendment. We've postponed a discussion on commercial allocation. We may need to take action to meet rebuilding. I'm just not seeing a lot of value in that trigger in the next decade. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And we'll go to John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Megan was going to make the same motion that I was, so I will let her do that.
All right, Tony, do we have any other hands raised for discussion on this?
We have Tom Fody.
All right, Tom.
Yeah, I didn't want to chime in before, but I remember when we basically made changes in regulations, not based on triggers, but other, and that's going back a long time. We've done that. We've gone through this document a lot. I'm ready to go out to public hearings, and I really, unless I can find strong feelings against any one of them, and I don't feel that strongly about B3 to take it out. I just want to rather go out to public hearings and find out what the public feels on a lot of these issues. We've been looking at them for 2 years now, and I think it's time just to send it out to the public and let them look at it and make a decision without us starting to remove a bunch of things, because we could be here all night picking union again, like we've been doing for the last 3 sessions. I'd like to get this out for public hearings.
All right, thank you, Tom. Any others, Tony?
No other hands, Marty.
All right, Megan, I'll bring it back to you then. If you want to go ahead and tee up a motion, and staff could go ahead and capture that, and then we'll need a second.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Reading it into the record, move to remove in section 4.1 management triggers, sub-option B3 in tier 1, fishing mortality management triggers, 3-year or parentheses, 3-year average F exceeds F threshold from draft amendment 7.
Thank you, Megan. Do we have a second? I think we might.
John McMurray.
Thank you, John. All right, so we have a motion and we have a second. And Megan, I'll come back. Is there anything more you want to add to your rationale for the motion? And I'll come to John, then we'll open it up for discussion to the board.
I think my rationale has been provided, so I'm all set. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. John, did you want to add anything, or we can go to discussion?
No, thank you. I think I made my concerns pretty clear.
All right, thank you both. So we'll open this up. We have a motion on the floor, and we'll go to discussion. And as I said previously, we will go to the public before we bring this back to the board for a vote. The floor is open. We get to raise any hands for comments, discussion on the motion.
We just have one hand, Chris Bat-Savage. Oh, two hands, Chris and Justin Davis.
All right, Chris, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I support the motion, for the reasons given by and the concerns given. I think again, it's not going to be likely to hit this this threshold with the timing of things, and on its face, it's already a little on the risky side, waiting for 3 years to exceed 3 years average F exceeding the threshold. And in terms of going out to the public, since due to the unlikely of hitting this, I think it would probably be better to take it out of the amendment now, so the public can focus on the many other options that we really need feedback on, as opposed to this one that seems a little problematic. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, and over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a bit torn on this. I can appreciate the rationale provided by Megan and John, and I appreciate Chris's comments. The thing about sub-option B3 that appeals to me is allowing us to use 3 years of data, a 3-year average of F, which I think provides us the best ability to sort of, eliminate the undue influence of one potentially sort of outlier year, allows us to incorporate the most amount of information and smooth out the estimate of F as much as possible. Then again, I do have these concerns that this trigger may ultimately be too conservative as constructed and not be tripped often enough. I think, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, there may be ways for the board to either amend this sub-option where we decide this is the one we want to ultimately adopt, and or potentially adjust future stock assessment schedules to potentially, ameliorate that issue of the trigger not being tripped often enough. I guess I'm looking at this through the lens of, does this need to come out now before it goes to public comment? We're not taking final action right now, and I think right now I'm leaning towards leaving it in, although I do agree that as constructed it could be problematic and might need further consideration if this is the sub-option we ultimately decided to adopt at final action. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. Tony, any other board members wish to comment on this?
Two hands, three hands. Justin Davis, Max Appelman, and Mike Luisi.
Yeah, I think Justin just spoke.
Yeah,
yeah right.
Sorry.
No worries. So, Max, you're up.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I'm with Justin on this right now. Given where we are in the process, we're talking about a scoping document. I think I'd rather keep this in because I see a trade-off between options B2 and B3 right now. On the one hand, the more years of data you use in this trigger definition, the better handle we're getting on where true F is under that management action, right? Speaking to the point of smoothing out that variability in F from year to year. But on the other hand, the more years you're required to use, the less, the more years, I guess, you have to wait until you can evaluate that trigger. And I just think that if the intent here is about addressing that variability in F, then having two options for the public to weigh in on is going to help us evaluate, what's more important. How many years we need to wait between evaluating this trigger, or how many years of data we're using to try to find that true F value. So I think I'm in favor of keeping this in the document for public comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Max, and over to Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have a question related to what Max just ended up with in his statement, which was looking at this option as some way a delay in taking action. I do agree with Justin and Max that if we can use 3 years of F obtain the average from a longer time series. In my mind, that's better than 2 years. But maybe my question's more for Emily is, so it's going to take a little while, obviously, until we have 3 years of information after this amendment is finalized to use in this evaluation. So is there a way that we can, I mean, I'm struggling with the question. Is there a delay? I'm trying to figure out where the delay is if this option stays in and we use it in the amendment for final action, because we already have fishing mortality and we're going to get a new estimate of fishing mortality. Well, all we're doing then is suggesting that we go back and use 3 years of fishing mortality in order to determine whether or not a trigger is tripped. So where's the delay? If you can help me understand that. I think the public is not going to be happy with the delay, and I certainly understand that, but I'm trying to figure out where the delay that everyone's speaking of comes into play here.
Emily, are you or other staff able to address Mike's question?
Absolutely. So thanks, Mike. So the delay would come in because with requiring 3 years in order to evaluate the trigger, then, overfishing could be occurring for 2 years, but the board would be delayed in taking action potentially to address that overfishing because that action wouldn't be required until you have that 3rd year of data. So that's the concept of the delay, in that F could be over the threshold for 1 or 2 years, but the board wouldn't be required to take action until there are 3 years of data available. So that's sort of where the delay concept comes in terms of being delayed in addressing overfishing.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, if I could just follow up. So if I understand that correctly, it's 3 new years of information that would be required in order to trip this trigger, rather than the time series that's already been established and just using 3 years, the most recent 3 years average. I can understand that if it's 3 new years of average of fishing mortality, but if that's the case, then I can't go forward with this motion, or I can support the motion to get rid of it because I think 3 years is too long to wait. I just thought there was another way around it, that we could still use 3 years in the average, but not have to wait 3 years to get the data to do that averaging. And that's all. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. Tony, anyone else with any more discussion?
2 more hands. Richie White, followed by Tom Fody.
All right, Richie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I support the motion. I think Mike Luisi just, made the strong argument to do away with this. And this is exactly what the public doesn't want to see us do. The public wants to see us act faster, not slower. So strongly supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Richie. Tom Fody.
Yeah, the more I think about this, the more I realize how many times we've actually acted and then basically 2 years changed our mind because of retrospective analysis. And I think this doesn't stop us, that if we start seeing things in 2 years, it started in motion, but the 3rd year that we're basically seeing it, then we confirm. So it doesn't stop you from doing it. It doesn't have to be new information. You have 2 years of information that says it's happening. You're asking for 1 more year to make sure, because we've changed. I know New Jersey had to change regulations 3 times because they said we had to do this because this is what it showed, and then it came back 2 years later. No, you have to go back to the other regulations because we weren't overfishing. And so I'm always concerned when we do knee-jerk reactions, go one way or the other, whether it's conservative or liberalizing. I mean, and we should have the same rules for both of them. But it doesn't stop us from acting. If we see this 1 year pattern, then 2 year pattern, we could start whatever we need to do. And if the 3rd year confirms it, then we basically could act. That's the way I'm reading it. Maybe I'm wrong. At least if I'm wrong, please answer my question.
All right, thank you, Tom. And I do want to give the public a chance, to comment if they'd like to. Are there any other board members that would like to offer comments?
Mike Armstrong.
All right, Mike, you have the last word, and then we're going to go to the public.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm a little confused. I don't think these have to be new data we're using, right? So say 2 years from now, we do an assessment and it shows 4 years back, we've been exceeding it. Because these have changed a little bit. There is a retrospective pattern. It's not bad in the assessment, but they do change. So it's conceivable we can turn the crank on an assessment in 2 years and have data going back more than 2 years that we can use. So if I'm reading that right, it doesn't have to be new data, Emily, correct? I mean, if the assessment says we've been overfishing for 3 years, then we can use this trigger. Is that correct? Am I thinking about that right?
So it doesn't have to be new data, and that it doesn't have to be new to this assessment. The requirement is that those 3 years need to be under the same management action. So, for example, under this B3 option, you couldn't average 1 year of addendum 4F with 2 years of addendum 6F to get those 3 years. You would need to have 3 years of F under addendum 6 to average.
If I can comment again, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. I'm uncertain what to do with this, as some of the others are, and I'm tending to keep it in for public comment and think about it some more. So I'll probably vote against this.
All right, thank you, Mike. I'd like to now go to the public before we come back to the board for a vote. So I'll ask at this time if any members of the public would like to offer comment on this motion. And Tony, I'll look to you for any hands.
We have Charlie Whittick.
All right, Mr. Whittick.
I did write a letter to the board on this issue, and the reason it concerned me is that we assume that in the terminal year of the assessment, for the first time, we find that F has exceeded the threshold. Now we have to wait for 2 years, and this is where the new data issue comes in. Yes, it's possible there'll be a couple years of old data in the assessment, but let's assume it's in the terminal year of the assessment that overfishing first occurs, that we have to wait for 2 more years before action is taken. And one of the points nobody ever wants to talk about is, yes, there's uncertainty in the assessment, but uncertainty cuts both ways. Nobody seems to be concerned that perhaps overfishing's been occurring for a few years, but because of uncertainty in the assessment, it looks like we're sitting just below the threshold. So it's very possible overfishing could have been going on longer. That's why avoiding the point estimate is probably a bad idea. We're talking about threshold here, not target. I would argue that when fishing mortality is so high that we're talking about taking action based only on the uncertainty, that it's already high enough that action is warranted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whittick. Tony, are there any other members of the public who would like to offer comment?
We have 2 additional members. The first is Bob Danielson, and then it'll be followed by Julian Frank.
All right, Mr. Danielson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I am in full support of this motion. I believe waiting for 3 years under any particular amendment for data is too long, and it has the ability to negatively affect the stock by overfishing And until we get that third year of data in, it may be, putting us behind the proverbial 8 ball. Again, I support this option, this motion to remove option B3. I think it's dangerous. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll now go to Mr. Frank.
Testing audio. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you, Mr. Frank. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. It seems like under consistent management seems to be the key word here, term. I'm just looking for a definition of exactly what that means. And then overall, just listening to, the board discuss this, seems like people are having a hard time defining the 3-year and the 3-year period. Just the confusion around this discussion alone doesn't leave much confidence to this being implemented. So yeah, I think you're right. As speaking as a member of the public, nothing about this is attractive. I'd recommend its removal. But lastly, if I can get a definition of under consistent management, that'd be helpful.
Emily, can you provide that definition?
Sure. So with these multi-year average trigger options, under consistent management or under the same management for either 2 or in this case 3 years means that the fishery is operating under management requirements under the same management document. So for example, under the same addendum or the same amendment. So again, for example, in order to average 3 years, all those 3 years in question would need to be operating under the requirements of the same addendum.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony, any other members of the public?
I have one for sure, and I'm working in the chat to see if I have a second. Taylor Favre.
All right, Taylor, floor is yours.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I'm in agreement with Mr. Whittick's comments, and that I think one thing that the board should keep in mind is that the stock was set to be overfished in 2018, and it is now 2022, and so we're behind the 8 ball already. And so I think when we have data that points towards overfishing occurring, it's really important that the board does everything in its power to show the public that they're going to take action to recover the stock as quickly as possible. And to have to wait for 3 years of data to point, in that direction, I think is just repeating sort of where we're at now, which is, like I said, behind the 8 ball on this whole thing. And so I'm in agreement and support that this be removed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Taylor. Tony, do we resolve the other person's audio?
One last name, Greg Kudinik.
All right, Greg, you have the floor, and then we're going to bring this back to the board.
Thank you. I'm in agreement with the comments, and I support motion to remove B3. Just feel that the time is of the essence here. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And Emily, before I bring this back to the board for a vote, could you remind me if there was a specific posture the AP had regarding this particular option, or did they have any feedback specific, just as a reminder to the board?
So one AP member did note concern about both of the multi-year average options, B2 and B3, while a few other AP members noted support for considering these multi-year average options in general.
All right, thank you, Emily. All right, it's pretty clear we're not going to get a vote through consent, so we're going to have a vote. Does the board need time to caucus? Anyone raise their hand, and we'll provide some time if you need it.
I see hands raised for caucus, and I believe Max Appelman, he had his hand up before you asked about caucus, so I don't know if he has a question for clarification.
Yeah, that's fine. Max, go ahead. Did you have a question before we move to a caucus?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to highlight what I think Justin brought it up initially, in that, well, I guess I'm hearing a lot of focus on the years of data, basically the PDT recommendation about the years of data, new data we would need to evaluate this, rather than focus on the intent of what this option does, which is to smooth out the variability of F from year to year. I think what I heard from Justin is, come final action, we don't need to have that strict, 3 new years of data under a management action in there. What I would like to hear from the public is if that variability in F is if it swings so much from year to year under consistent regulations, does it make more sense to evaluate 3 data points against this threshold, or 2? And I would like to hear that, and that's why I'm going to, again, sorry to have the last word here, but I think we should keep this in, get the public's opinion, and come final action. If that is a sticking point, we have the ability to remove that limitation about new years of data.
Okay, thank you, Max. Given the level of complexity and what I'm hearing in the tenor of the discussion, we're going to go ahead and do a 3-minute caucus. Tony, can you set the timer?
We will do. Just give us 1 second to get it up.
All right, the timer is set.
Phil, while the commissioners are caucusing, I'm going to try to unmute you and see if you can speak. So you go ahead. I am not hearing you, Phil. You're unmuted, but I just don't hear you. I see your note that you're going to call in. Thanks, Phil.
It looks like the clock stopped on my screen, Tony. I don't know if that's just me.
Sorry, Marty, that's me. The time just went up. It's been 3 minutes.
Okay, no worries. All right. We will go ahead and call the question then. Tony, are you ready for us to call it?
I'm ready.
Okay, all of those in favor of this motion, should I read this into the record, Tony?
I don't think we've changed it, so I don't think you need to read it into the record.
Okay, very good, thank you. All right, all of those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Tony will get the count.
Just going to give the hands a moment to settle here. I have New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Maine, Rhode Island, District of Columbia, Maryland, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
All right.
Hands down.
Hands down. All those opposed to the motion, please raise your hand.
I have New Jersey, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Connecticut, NOAA Fisheries, Massachusetts, and Delaware. Put the hands down.
Are there any null votes?
I have no null votes.
Are there any abstentions?
I have no abstentions.
Mr. Chair, I have 10 in favor and 6 opposed.
All right, thank you, Emily. So the motion passes 10-6. Thank you very much. So Emily, just double checking where we are. Does that put us through that section, or is there more to do there?
Mr. Chair, I don't have any additional slides, but if there's any other discussion before I move on to the next section, just let me know.
All right, so I'll put the question back to the board. It looks like we're through management triggers, but if we're not, and I'm in error, please raise your hand. One last chance before we move on to the next section. Anyone, Tony?
I have no hands, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Emily, I think it's safe to say we can move on to the next section.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me get my screen set up. All right, so moving on to the next section of Draft Amendment 7. This part of my presentation will cover section 4.2.1, which are the recreational size and bag limit options to protect strong year classes. And I'll also review the new rebuilding section 4.4 before pausing for questions. So starting with the measures to protect strong year classes, the board and stakeholders have expressed that protecting strong year classes is important for stock rebuilding. And in particular, there is some concern that the strong 2015 year class will soon be entering the recreational slot limit for the ocean region of 28 inches to less than 35 inches. And if this ocean slot is maintained, the 2015 year class may be subject to high recreational harvest mortality in the ocean, potentially reducing its potential to help rebuild the stock. And this 2015 year class is also subject to release mortality coast-wide, and that year class has already been available to the Chesapeake Bay fisheries for the past few years. The technical committee also noted that both the 2017 and the 2018 year classes were above average in multiple juvenile abundance indices, and these year classes have recently become available to the Chesapeake Bay fisheries. So the options in this section consider whether to change the ocean and or the Chesapeake Bay recreational size and bag limits to enhance protection of these strong year classes. So the intent here is to reduce harvest on the 2015, 2017, and or 2018 year classes by shifting that harvest to other year classes. It's important to note that while this would provide some protection from harvest in the short term, those year classes will still be subject to recreational release mortality. And then another
Emily?
point. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted your presentation is on pause, so we're still seeing the management trigger. Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tony. And a final point to consider here throughout this section, and something that the technical committee and the plan development team emphasized, is the uncertainty around how angler behavior and fishing effort would change in response to changes in size limits and changes in fish availability. So the options proposed for the ocean recreational fishery are listed on the slide here. Option A is the status quo slot of 28 inches to less than 35 inches with a 1 fish bag limit. And this status quo option would maintain the current state implementation plans and CE programs from Addendum 6. Option B is a 35-inch minimum size limit and a 1 fish bag limit. Option C is a 32-inch to less than 40-inch slot with a 1 fish bag limit. And option D is a 28-inch to less than 32-inch slot with a 1 fish bag limit. Just important to note here that if the recreational size limit does change from the status quo through options B, C, or D, those new size limits would also apply to the Chesapeake Bay spring trophy fishery, which is considered part of the ocean fishery for management purposes. And this is something the board discussed at the October 2021 board meeting because this fishery targets coastal migratory striped bass. Next are the options proposed for the Chesapeake Bay recreational fishery. Option A is the status quo of an 18-inch minimum size limit with a 1 fish bag limit. And again, this status quo option would maintain current state implementation plans and CE programs from Addendum 6. Option B is an 18-inch to less than 23-inch slot limit and a 2 fish bag limit. And then option C is an 18-inch to less than 28-inch slot limit with a 1 fish bag limit. And there are 2 sub-options for option C. Option C1 would maintain all the components of Addendum 6 CE programs for the Chesapeake Bay, except the recreational size limits would be modified to include an upper bound of less than 28. And sub-option C2 would require new CE proposals to be submitted. So the board would have to select either sub-option C1 or C2. If alternative recreational measures are selected through any of those alternative size limits, the board will need to address conservation equivalency considerations. So first here under Tier 1, this considers how or if conservation equivalency could be applied to these alternative size and bag limits to protect year classes. So under option A, CE would be permitted subject to any restrictions or requirements that are selected later on in the CE section of the draft amendment. And just a note here, the PDT does not recommend this option A because allowing CE could compromise the goal of setting specific size limits to protect particular year classes. Under option B, CE would be permitted with certain limitations on the range of CE measures that could be proposed, again, subject to any restrictions selected in the CE section. And under option C, CE would not be permitted. Another consideration for conservation equivalency here is under Tier 2, and that considers how changing the recreational size limits would impact current Addendum 6 CE programs that combined recreational and commercial measures to achieve the Addendum 6 reduction. So specifically considering CE programs that implemented a less than 18% reduction in commercial quota offset by a larger reduction in recreational removals. So under option A here, the commercial quota levels implemented through those CE programs would carry forward. And under option B, those commercial quota levels implemented through Addendum 6 CE would not carry forward, and those states would be subject to the FMP standard quotas. So in addition to the options themselves, the draft amendment outlines the analysis developed by the technical committee and the plan development team to evaluate these size limit options. So the TC first estimated the length at age for striped bass, which then informed estimates of the level of protection that each size limit option would provide, referred to as the percent protected from harvest, or the percent of each year class that is outside the size limit. The TC then developed projections to evaluate the potential impact on stock productivity and impact to the rebuilding timeline for the alternative size limits as compared to the status quo. So this table on the screen shows the estimated average striped bass length at age based on age data compiled for the last stock assessment. The average length at age for the 2015, 2017, and 2018 year classes in 2023 are bolded here. It's important to note here that these length at age estimates are coast-wide estimates that are based on data compiled from several states. Since size at age is highly variable along the coast, the average length at age for the Chesapeake Bay may differ from these coast-wide estimates used for this analysis. So for the percent protected analysis, all the size limit options considered in this section would provide greater protection from harvest for all 3 year classes in 2023 relative to the status quo. However, that level of protection will change over time as those fish continue to grow. The PDT noted that this percent protection analysis is useful to compare the relative changes in protection among the different options, but there are some limitations to this analysis, one being that this analysis doesn't account for the differences between ocean and Chesapeake Bay fisheries and when different size fish are available in those regions. So in addition to this percent protected analysis, the PDT also estimated the reduction in removals that each option would provide relative to the 2017 removals. And so all the options presented in this section are estimated to achieve at least an 18% reduction in removals relative to 2017. So this is consistent with the required Addendum 6 reduction. I mentioned the TC developed projections to consider the potential effects of alternative size limits on spawning stock biomass levels as compared to the status quo option. And these projections assumed a constant level of fishing mortality for each scenario, so assumed fishing at the F target. And these projections also assumed fishing effort was the same and constant for each scenario. These projections change the selectivity pattern for each size limit scenario based on what proportion of each year class would be available to the fishery. So the initial set of projections were developed based on changing the ocean size limit only, and then an additional set of projections were developed considering changes to both the Chesapeake Bay and the ocean fisheries. So details on those projection scenarios were provided in the appendix of the draft document. A couple key findings to note here from the technical committee. For all the projection scenarios, the stock recovery timeline, so that's the year when SSB would exceed the threshold and the year when SSB would exceed the target, is the same for all scenarios, including for the status quo scenarios. Another finding is that the overall projected change in total spawning stock biomass relative to the status quo is positive for most scenarios. However, that percent change in total SSB under the different size limits is not statistically significant. These results indicate that changing the selectivity does not have a significant impact on rebuilding the stock if fishing mortality stays constant. So if the goal is to expedite stock rebuilding, then controlling the overall fishing mortality rate is more important than only changing the selectivity through changing size limits. So after discussion of these options and the analysis regarding the year class protection, the PDT is recommending that the board remove this section from consideration in draft amendment 7. So if these options are removed, then the addendum 6 FMP standard for recreational size and bag limits would be maintained for draft amendment 7. So the FMP standard for the ocean recreational fishery would be 28 inches to less than 35-inch slot with a 1-fish bag limit. And then for the Chesapeake Bay, the FMP standard would be the 18-inch minimum size limit and a 1-fish bag limit. And as I mentioned previously, these status quo options would maintain the current state implementation plans and CE programs from Addendum 6. So the PDT is recommending removing these options for 2 primary reasons. The first is the projection results. And again, the results indicate that the stock recovery timeline is the same for all size limit options, including the status quo. The board added this issue of protecting year classes to draft amendment 7 in order to support stock rebuilding, but these projections indicate that changing the size limits does not have a significant impact on rebuilding the stock if the F rate remains constant. And the PDT's second reason for their recommendation is that selecting new recreational measures through amendment 7 before the 2022 stock assessment update would present some significant timing challenges, especially considering the uncertainty of how Amendment 7 measures would align with the stock assessment results. So in other words, there's uncertainty as to whether Amendment 7 measures would achieve stock rebuilding. So for example, if the assessment indicates that a reduction would be needed to rebuild the stock, Amendment 7 measures may or may not achieve that reduction. And if they don't, then the board would have to reconsider recreational measures again after the assessment. And that would mean reconsidering new measures again during the same year. On the other hand, the assessment could indicate that the status quo Addendum 6 measures may achieve stock rebuilding. And if that's the case, then changing measures through Amendment 7 may not be warranted at this time. So in either case, this would present some conflict with the board's desire for management stability. So regarding advisory panel input, one AP member noted support for removing these options from the document, considering the process of adjusting to changes in recreational measures and size limits can be costly for the industry. On the other hand, several AP members noted support for maintaining these options in Draft Amendment 7. Those AP members noted that the public should have the opportunity to comment on alternative size limits and what they want to see in the fishery. They also noted that some size limit options would result in a greater reduction in harvest, and some alternatives may reduce release mortality. Additionally, some AP members noted that diverse age structure is also important to consider, and that although these options may not significantly increase spawning stock biomass, protecting these strong year classes is still important considering that future recruitment is highly variable. One AP member also noted the use of closed seasons to protect year classes, and some AP members noted the potential relationship between protecting large fish and the quality of striped bass eggs and recruits. So that wraps up the year class section, and before I pause for questions and discussion on that section, I'm going to review the rebuilding section as well. This section provides some additional context on the timing of the stock assessment and Amendment 7 that I mentioned earlier. So when the benchmark stock assessment was accepted for management use in 2019, the spawning stock biomass threshold trigger was tripped, and the board is required to rebuild SSB to the target by no later than 2029. And the board has expressed some concern about the recent low recruitment estimates and the potential impact of this low recruitment on the ability of the stock to rebuild. As part of the analysis for the recruitment trigger that we discussed earlier in the draft amendment, the TC identified 2007 to 2020 as a low recruitment period, and that's based on the Maryland Juvenile Abundance Index. And these several years of poor recruitment may indicate that the level of removals that was sustainable during an average or an above average recruitment period may not be sustainable during this low recruitment period. So this section of the draft amendment considers which recruitment assumption to apply to the rebuilding calculations, and it also outlines the rebuilding plan framework and responding to the 2022 stock assessment results. So I mentioned the 2022 stock assessment update is expected to be complete and presented at the October board meeting. And this assessment will provide updated spawning stock biomass and fishing mortality reference point values, and it will also provide an updated evaluation of stock status with a terminal year of 2021. And this assessment update will incorporate 2 years of data under Addendum 6, that's 2020 and 2021. The assessment will also calculate the fishing mortality rate that would be required to rebuild spawning stock biomass to the target by 2029, and this is referred to as F-rebuild. And F-rebuild is distinct from F-target in that F-rebuild takes into account that 10-year rebuilding timeframe. On the other hand, F-target is calculated to achieve the target in the long term without taking into account a specific rebuilding timeframe. And then finally, the assessment will provide stock projections going forward. So the option for consideration in this section is related to calculating this F-rebuild. So F-rebuild could be calculated using different assumptions for recruitment. Typically, F-rebuild is calculated by drawing recruitment from values observed from 1990 and forward. This is referred to as the standard recruitment method, which is option A. However, F-rebuild could be calculated by drawing recruitment only from a below average period, and this would be option B, referred to as the low recruitment regime assumption. So using the low recruitment assumption in option B would be a more conservative approach that would result in a lower F-rebuild value to achieve stock rebuilding by 2029. And from the advisory panel, some AP members noted support for this more conservative approach, especially considering the recent low juvenile abundance index values. So the figure in this section of the draft amendment outlines how Amendment 7 will inform the 2022 stock assessment update. So Amendment 7, with potential final action in May, will determine the recruitment assumption used for the assessment, as I just described, either the standard recruitment method or the low recruitment assumption. Draft Amendment 7 at this point includes the year class options for selecting recreational size and bag limits, and the amendment maintains status quo commercial measures. So then moving into the 2022 assessment in October, that assessment again will provide an updated evaluation of stock status. The assessment will calculate F-rebuild using the recruitment method selected through Amendment 7. And the assessment will also develop stock projections taking into account measures under Amendment 7. So there are two potential outcomes of the 2022 assessment. The first, on the left with the green box, would be the good news. If the projections indicate that the rebuilding target will be achieved under Amendment 7 measures, then those Amendment 7 measures are sufficient for rebuilding, and those measures would be implemented in 2023. On the other hand, on the right side, in the red box, the assessment could indicate that Amendment 7 measures will not achieve the rebuilding target. So in that case, the assessment would calculate what reduction would be needed to achieve F-rebuild, and an addendum could be developed in 2023 to consider new measures that would meet that required reduction. So in that case, those addendum measures would likely not be implemented until 2024. And then in either case, The next opportunity after that to evaluate rebuilding progress would be the following stock assessment, potentially a benchmark, maybe around 2025. So, Mr. Chair, that wraps up my slides on the rebuilding section and on the year class section, and I'm happy to take any questions on either section.
Okay, thanks very much, Emily. And I appreciate you covering both of those sections because of the inherent linkage between the two of them. That helped me a lot. Hopefully it helped others. So at this point, what we're going to do is just go with questions for now, and then go into the discussion as we did in the previous section. So Tony, I'll look to you for hands raised for questions for Emily.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have Megan Ware, Justin Davis, and John McMurray.
Okay, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this question may be most appropriate for Katie because we were admittedly emailing back and forth about it. But my question is, in table 4, that table presents different ocean size limits, and it looks at the reduction in total removals. And there are some options there, such as option D, which is a 28-inch to 32-inch slot that results in a higher level of removals than options we chose previously. However, when looking at the appendix, that same option results in the worst outcome for SSB. And then conversely, there's the 35-inch minimum that results in the smallest reduction in total removals, but the best outcome in SSB. And I found those results to be a bit confounding. So I'm hoping that either staff or Katie is able to help explain those outcomes.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to defer to Katie if she could take this question.
Sure. I think it's a good question, and I think it is maybe a little unintuitive, but I think the thing to keep in mind is that the technical committee's analysis specifically separated the effects of a reduction in removals and the effects of changing what ages or sizes the fishery is operating on through the size and bag limit changes. So we did not account for any potential reduction in removals that those regulations changes could cause. We only focused on if F was the same across, or if, essentially if removals or effort was the same in all of those different options, which option would provide the best outcome for the stock in terms of spawning stock biomass. And so this was done, like I said, to kind of separate that effect of some of these regulations may or may not cause a change in removals from 2020 levels. And so from status quo levels. And so we wanted to focus on what's the effect just in terms of their ability to protect that year class. And so overall, as Emily said, the analysis showed that controlling F is really more important than controlling or it was more important than any of the options that we looked at, any of the options in this document in terms of affecting the selectivity and affecting what proportion of the population is vulnerable to that fishery. And so while those options, I think while that option D might reduce harvest in the short term because it is more restrictive than the current status quo measures, it wouldn't necessarily do any better of a job than any other option that would provide the same level of removals. So hopefully that helps. If not, I can try to explain further.
A quick follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead, Megan.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, Katie. Yeah, I guess to summarize that maybe, and you can tell me if I'm wrong in saying this, these projections are looking at a change in selectivity and not any accompanying change in total removals that may come with that management change. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. And Tony, I hate to ask you again. I thought I heard you say John McMurray, but there was a couple others I didn't quite get. Or did
We had
I get?
Justin Davis first, then John McMurray, and now Tom Foti is in the queue.
Justin, John, Tom. Okay, Justin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to try to sneak in two questions here in my one question. Both questions pertain to the rebuilding plan and specifically the low recruitment assumption. I'm wondering if there is some way when we send this out to public comment to illustrate to the public the actual sort of difference that it would make to select sort of our status quo approach to F versus the F rebuild characterized by low recruitment. I mean, we can tell the public that, you know, the status quo approach is using the full time series of recruitment from 1990 forward, and the low recruitment approach is using just the time series from 2007 forward, where recruitment's been low. But I'm wondering if it would be possible to do something like a retroactive analysis of the addendum 6 outcome had we used the more conservative estimate of recruitment. Sort of how much higher of a reduction removal would we have been looking at in addendum 6 had we made that more conservative assumption about recruitment. So I'm wondering if there's something we can do to put in the document to sort of demonstrate to the public the actual difference that choosing that F rebuild would make. And the second question I have is, we often think with these documents that the board has the latitude at final action to select an option that's within the range of options contemplated in the document. Is that in play here? You know, essentially we have two options here characterized by using two different time series of recruitment to characterize recruitment. Could the board potentially at final action select some intermediate option to characterize low recruitment that uses a different set of years from the recruitment time series?
Thanks, Justin. This is Emily. To your first question about demonstrating, sort of more clearly demonstrating what selecting either of these options that are now up on the screen would mean. As part of the initial recruitment trigger analysis, the TC did look at a few different scenarios using, well, I guess it was a high versus a low recruitment regime. So I'll maybe hand it over to Katie to see, you know, what we could put together to better demonstrate, you know, what it would mean for F rebuild in terms of which option is selected here. To your second question about choosing a range of options, so, you know, potentially selecting or choosing a recruitment assumption that's somewhere between A and B. The only thing I would say about that is the TC hasn't identified any sort of intermediate option, so I'm not exactly sure what that would look like.
Just, Emily, I'm gonna fill in, Marty, if that's okay. You know, Justin, you know, as the boards in other species and this species have done before, they've chosen an option that fell between option X and Y. As long as it fell amongst the range, then it was in play. I've never done that before, to my recollection, in a rebuilding calculation, but I don't see why it wouldn't be able to do that as long as we could figure out a way to calculate it. I'm just trying to think through that. That would be the tricky part in my mind. You know, and the board acknowledged that that is something that they are willing to do here.
And this is Katie, just to, I think, follow up on the first part of that question, which was, can we do something to illustrate this better for the public? I would say we can, if the board is interested in that, I think we could definitely develop something. I think, as Emily was saying, our first sort of cut at this, we were saying the F, you know, under a low recruitment regime, the F target under a low recruitment regime would be something like 0.18 as opposed to 0.2. But I think we didn't do it, we didn't apply that for the rebuilding concept. But I will also say, you know, I would be I think we'd want to be very careful not to do anything that could conflict with the results of the upcoming stock assessment, so that I don't want to put anything out there that looks like a rebuilding plan based on the 2017 assessment, because the board never requested any kind of information like that from the TC. So there are some projections that exist out there already, and we could do something similar for this with this lower recruitment. But I think we would just want to make sure that we're not trying to that we don't put anything out there that will then later be superseded by the upcoming stock assessment.
Justin, do you have a follow for that, or?
No, I'm good. Thank you everybody for those thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Justin. So we're still on questions, and before I go to John McMurray, I just want to mention in our agenda, we've got to stop at 3:30 for a 15-minute break. I'd like to honor that, so everybody can just take a breather. So again, we're on questions only now, so John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question regarding measures to protect 2015, 2017, and 2018 year classes. And I do understand the rationale for the PDT's recommendation to take that out, particularly the timing challenge of selecting new measures before the 22 assessment. And something like a 35-inch size limit protects the 2015s for a few years, and then once they reach 35 or 36 inches, well, they aren't protected, and thus there's no real benefit in the long run. But I do understand, I understand that wasn't the intent here to protect those good year classes, particularly the 2015s, until they could contribute significantly to the female SSB before they were harvested. It certainly seems like something like a 35-inch limit would achieve that. Yes, I understand we're just redirecting F onto other year classes, but it's the 2015s that are abundant and that we'd hope would make a significant contribution to SSB. So maybe, Emily, you could explain the rationale to me a little better, because I still don't quite get it, and I'm not going to oppose taking it out, but I need to understand a little better how you guys are determining that it won't work.
Thanks for the question, John. I don't think that the PDT isn't saying that these measures won't protect year classes. So based on the percent protected analysis, that indicates that these measures indeed will protect these year classes. What the PDT is highlighting is that changing the size limits to protect these year classes won't significantly impact the total spawning stock biomass levels, and therefore the stock won't recover any faster than it would under the status quo slot limit. So, this analysis is showing that these year classes will be more protected, but that protection won't lead to significantly, speeding up the time by which the stock would recover. And for the PDT, it was really that results from the projections coupled with the timing challenges with the upcoming assessment and the uncertainty around if any of the measures proposed in this section, whether it's the status quo or any of the alternatives, would achieve rebuilding. We just won't know that until the assessment. So it's the combination of the fact that these measures won't, or the projection that these measures won't expedite rebuilding, along with the timing challenges that led the PDT to this recommendation.
Did that answer your question, John, or did you have a follow?
It did answer my question, but there's a disconnect here somewhere. It seems counterintuitive that a super abundant year class, once it recruits, wouldn't somehow, expedite the rebuilding or make a major contribution to female SSB. But I guess I'll have to leave it to people that are much smarter than me, because I do trust the PDT's analysis. So thank you.
All right, thank you, John. The next up is Tom Foti.
Yeah, I didn't see any analysis when I'm looking through this by putting in more restrictive measures and smaller slot limits. We know that's going to increase the hook and release mortality. And what is the consequences of basically making those changes that will produce more hook and release mortality? Since hook and release mortality is the major, the major mortality in this fishery as far as the recreational, and almost as big as the commercial and recreational mortality combined. That's the first question. The second question, I'm kind of confused here. We're making all these assumptions that by increasing the spawning stock biomass, we're actually going to have great recruitment, but nowhere do I see in this rebuilding that this is based on also the right environmental conditions. Because, we can try to basically protect the spawning stock biomass, but we can't control the environmental conditions. And we've had good recruitment with much lower stock assessment than we have had right now. So I'm just looking to where that's going to state in the document, because we're building people's hopes on a document that I see is ignoring that fact.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Tom.
Emily, Emily, I think I understood part of Tom's question. Are you good with that?
Yeah, so I can try to address both aspects. So the first question about the increase in release mortality associated with changing the recreational size limit. So as part of the analysis and the calculations of what the change in total removals would be for each option relative to 2017, there's a table in the amendment that outlines how those changes to the size limits would impact harvest and how the predicted changes to release mortality. So for all of the options, there would be a pretty significant reduction in harvest, and release mortality would just increase by a couple percentage points, resulting in total removals, a reduction in total removals, somewhere between 18%, all the way up to 30%. So the calculation of the percent change in removals for these options does address release mortality. However, something that the TC and PDT emphasize is that there's uncertainty as to how angler behavior and effort will change if the size limits change. And also depending on if, certain year classes become more or less available to the fishery. So, while the analysis takes into account release mortality where possible, all of the analysis assumes that effort would remain constant, and that's a big source of uncertainty. And then as far as your second point about recruitment and the importance of environmental conditions for successful recruitment, as part of the recruitment trigger section, the PDT does note that there is a weak stock recruit relationship for striped bass, and the environmental conditions do play a big part. And as far as the recruitment trigger goes, responding to periods of low recruitment by reducing fishing pressure, won't necessarily increase future recruitment because of that weak stock recruit relationship. So the PDT did try to address that earlier in the document.
Tom, did that adequately answer your questions, or do you have a follow?
Well, it just doesn't do it. In the section where we're talking about putting all these restrictions, it should also mention it in this section also, because we're setting expectations. We do that with summer flounder. We basically set expectations that we protect the spawning stock by raising the size limit constantly. We're going to do good, and we see poor recruitment, and when we had smaller size limits, we saw better recruitment. And we constantly tell it to the public. They're expecting us to basically do this, and a lot of times it's not working. It's not working on a lot of species. And I don't know how it's going to work on striped bass because of the environment, the way it's changing with global warming and everything else that comes into play.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Tony, are there other folks queued up with questions for Emily and staff?
Yes, we have 3 additional names. We have David Sikorsky, Pat Gear, and Jesse Hornstein.
Okay, Dave Sikorsky, you are up, and happy belated birthday.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad the scheduling occurred today, not yesterday, for this meeting. So like in the last meeting, I've had a lot of focus on what stock we're exploiting in the Chesapeake, and then also what's being produced by the current spawning stock, and we see through our young of year surveys. And in looking at the rebuilding piece, the question that comes to mind, even more so now after Dr. Davis's comments about the bookending of a potential range of options, I wonder if the board could direct staff and TC to go even lower with the assumptions about recruitment. I think it would provide important guidance if we continue to see the Chesapeake, or at least the Maryland portion of the Chesapeake, fall below average, and just be smart in the sense of bookkeeping or the bookending component. So help me understand if I'm off here. I'm thinking that is a more conservative approach doable? Well, and maybe it's not from an average perspective based on past data, but is it doable? And I guess I'll stop there. I think that is my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. Emily, are you good with answering that, or?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Dave, for the question. Yes, I might defer to Katie here in a moment, but David, it sounds like you're thinking, looking at option B, which I'll put up on the screen, this low recruitment regime. You're, trying to think if there would be an even more conservative option than this option B. And, the only thing I'll say to that is that, based on the analysis the technical committee used to identify these periods of high and low recruitment, this is the low recruitment period they identified. So, I'll defer to Katie if there's potentially additional analysis that could identify an even more conservative option at this point. Katie, I think you're breaking up a little bit.
I'm having okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, not sure what's happening here. So yes, I think we could develop, for example, the low recruitment regime that we saw during the period of stock decline, from about the 2010s forward, was definitely not as low as some of the past low recruitment regimes we've seen, even within the stock assessment. So if the board was interested in seeing, what would rebuilding look like under recruitment levels that we saw in the early 80s, which was truly a low point for recruitment for this stock, that's something we could put together. We could pick a different percentile of that low recruitment regime. So instead of picking, say, the average or the median, pick the 25th percentile of recruitment in that regime. I think we would obviously look to the board for some sort of guidance on that kind of information. But I think, keeping in mind that talking about rebuilding to 2029, recruitment in the near term isn't, future recruitment in the near term isn't going to be a big impact on that timeline. It really is predominantly going to be what's already in the system, so to speak.
Thank you. No follow-ups.
All right, thank you, Dave. We have two other folks that had questions. I'd like to make a clean break. It's 3:30, but if we can squeeze these questions in, take a break, and then come back and then pick up with the discussion, that would be my preference. But this is a sensitive topic, we can all tell. So Tony, I guess a question before I go to Pat. Are there several more people that are queued up for questions, or do you think this might be the last couple?
There are no additional board members.
Okay, let's see if we can do that then. So Pat, I'll go to you, and then we'll go to Jesse, and then we're going to take our 15-minute break.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make this easy on you. I had a comment and not a question, and I'll hold that comment until later.
Thank you, Pat. Jesse, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is, so if the projections were done looking at So the projections that were done using the standard recruitment levels to get to back to the F target level, if they used the low recruitment regime to get to do those projections, would it be more important to protect large year classes under the low recruitment regime as opposed to the standard recruitment regime? That would be my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesse. And I'm going to, again, defer to Katie to see if there's any information we can provide. Because as you mentioned, yes, the projections for the year class section were done using the standard recruitment assumption.
So it's I would say, well, I mean, it's hard to predict exactly how those two would interact. I think probably the key would be protecting those year classes from the beginning, as opposed to right now where we're sort of trying to come in a little late on some of these year classes that have already been vulnerable. I mean, these fish, striped bass, are vulnerable to the fishery from about age 2 onwards. So I think, you know, trying to come in a little late on the protecting the year class may have less of an impact than, you know, if we did this rebuilding plan and tried to protect recruit strong year classes as they enter the fishery in the future down the line. That might have more of an impact, and whether, you know, it would have more of an impact, whether it would be more important to protect those strong year classes during a weaker recruitment regime. I think we'd have to sort of, you know, run the math and see if the benefits could be whether the benefits would be stronger in that situation, but it's not unreasonable to assume that.
Thanks, Katie. Jesse, does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
Oh, that answers it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jesse. So Emily and Tony, I think we're just a couple of minutes over. I'm showing 3:34. So I would like to go ahead and take the 15-minute break now and then transition over to discussion on this section, or these two sections. So we'll go ahead and break now, and Tony, if that's okay, we'll reconvene at, it would be 3:50, correct?
Correct, Marty.
Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break. Everybody catch their breath, get their thoughts together to the board, and we'll go ahead and discuss these two combined sections. Thank you.
Bill, if you want to try to test your mic, we can do that right now. Bill, if you want to test your mic, you can go ahead. And Phil, if you're speaking, I cannot currently hear you. And Phil, I know you said you joined via the phone. I don't see you listed in the computer via the phone. So again, IT is not my strength. I'm not sure if you've called and talked to Chris. but I still can't hear you. This is the board's 2-minute warning that we'll get started again. Okay, Marty, it's 3:50. I think we're ready to get started.
Okay, thanks, Tony, and welcome back, everyone. We're going to now transition to the discussion phase for these sections that Emily just covered. And I'd like to go ahead and open it up to the board. If you could raise your hands and indicate who would like to start the discussion. Again, we're looking at potential modification, removal, and possibly addition as well. Tony, do you have any hands up?
I do, Marty. I have Mike Armstrong.
All right, Dr. Armstrong, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a motion, and it will add to this document. And I've been struggling with where to bring this motion, but I think it's definitely germane to the rebuilding process, and it may give people a different way to think about the two things we're going to discuss right now. It might delay things, but I'd like to get it on the table, and perhaps you can decide if we talk about it now or maybe shove it down the road a little bit. I don't know if, Emily, do you have the motion?
I do, yes. Should be on the screen momentarily here.
Okay, so I will read it. Move to add an option to section 4.4 rebuilding plan that considers an alternative process for responding to the 2022 stock assessment as follows. If the 2022 stock assessment results indicate the Amendment 7 measures have less than a 50% probability of rebuilding the stock by 2029 as calculated using the recruitment assumptions specified in Amendment 7, and if the stock assessment indicates at least a 5% reduction in removals is needed to achieve F rebuild, the board may adjust measures to achieve F rebuild via board action. And just very briefly, this is about expediency, and the important element is it would take out the addendum process and make it a specification process for the board. And if I get a second, I'll explain a little bit more.
All right, thank you, Mike. Is there a second to Dr. Armstrong's motion?
I have Jason McNamee.
All right, thank you, Jason. Mike, it's back to you to build on your rationale.
Good, thank you. So this is, again, I'd like to see it in the document, and we don't have to implement it when we make that decision, but it adds a backstop. I'm worried about this stock. As you know, the last 3 years have been really bad recruitment. By the time the stock assessment comes out, we will have a shot at, we will see what the 22 year class looks like. And we don't know what's going to come out of the assessment. It may be okay if you use poor recruitment. It may not be okay. But we've been in this, what I would term a slump, and our constituency has seen this. We've been in it a number of years. And if we come out of this assessment and we have to take a reduction, we won't put that in till 2024. I don't think we should wait that long. I don't think the stock should wait that long for an action. So it is, it's unusual. It's a specification process. It cuts public opinion out, speeds it up tremendously. But it is done with other species like fluke and black sea bass and things like that. The things that we might want to discuss, the biggest thing is the board may adjust measures to achieve F rebuild via board action. Even if we accept that, we don't have to use it. The other thing is it's 50% probability of rebuilding. I think that's reasonable. That's what we usually go with. And then I talked to a number of people. If the stock assessment indicates at least a 5% reduction in removal. So our last plan, we had to reduce 18%. So what I'm saying is, if it's a trivial amount, if it comes back and the TC says you have to reduce by 4%, then fine, we go through the addendum process because things are not dire. If they come back and say we need a 20% reduction, then we can't wait a year, almost a year. Well, from now it's a year and a half to implement in 2024. So that's my rationale. It's really about expediency and crafting a different route that's very quick to reduce F if we need to. And we may or may not use this. But I'd like to see it in the document in section 4.4, the rebuilding plan.
Thank you, Mike. Jason, would you like to expand any thoughts you have for your second?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't say too much. I think just kind of thinking through the process here, thinking about the last process with striped bass, and I think folks who are getting really frustrated with the amount of time that things were taking, they feel a real immediate sense of the need for action. And so, I think I really appreciated Dr. Armstrong's motions, kind of thinking out ahead a little bit, getting us positioned to be able to react quickly rather than having to, bear the frustration of kind of letting all of the sequences line up. So I think it's a smart move to think out ahead of this a little bit, get ourselves positioned to be able to react quicker than we normally would be able to if we get continued bad signals out of the stock assessment. So thanks.
All right, thanks, Jason. Given the time, we have two more sections to cover, but the importance of this particular one, and I think a lot of folks on the board and the public, folks I've talked to, I'm sure others have as well, have ever since the plan development team memo came out, this is a thought that's come into their heads. So I appreciate I think this is going to help us to have this discussion. So we'll go ahead and pursue this now. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up to discussion with the board, and we'll go ahead and decide. This is, of course, is going to be an additive component. And I would also like to give the public an opportunity to comment on this before we go to a vote on this. So I'll open it up, Tony, to the board for questions and comments.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mike Armstrong, your mic is still open, just a FYI. We have Mike Luisi, Megan Ware, Justin Davis, Max Appelman, and Joe Cimino.
Tony, who was third in the queue? It was Mike, Megan, and then who was the third one you had? I just want to make sure I have this right. Justin Davis. Okay, and then Joe Cimino, correct? correct?
Max is in between Justin and Joe.
Got it. Okay, got it. All right, so we'll go first to Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, I think, well, let me first say that I absolutely support the idea behind this motion. I've been thinking about it myself a lot as to how we may be able to react to the upcoming assessment in a timely way to make adjustments if necessary. So I appreciate, Mike, you thinking about this as well and putting this before us. My question to you, Mike, is as far as intent on making adjustments to the measures, do you foresee, as you used in your example, let's say an 18 or let's say a 20% reduction is necessary from the result of the stock assessment? Do you envision the board using the specifications process to approve that 20% reduction, and then states will craft measures to achieve that via data that they would use in other cases under like through a conservation equivalency program? Or do you foresee the board in this case selecting the Chesapeake Bay alternatives or measures and the coastal measures and establishing new measures, which are specific to actual regulations that would need to be implemented?
Thanks, Mike. The way I envision it is at the October meeting, we would get the stock assessment results. If it comes back, we need X amount of reduction. We put this in action. We charge the TC with coming up options to achieve that. They come back in January, and we're presented with this suite of options, and the board picks. But I think probably in this is you go the other way, where we say this is the reduction you need. Well, no, let me take that back. My intent was that the board will make that decision. And then the whole CE will be complicated by what we pick for that option. It could be CE isn't on the table, and so it'll all be up to what comes out of the board.
Okay, thanks.
Michael,
I appreciate that, Mike.
Is that good? Okay.
Yeah, I think
right,
I got clarity there. Thanks, Marty.
All right, no problem, Mike. Next up is Megan Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to thank Mike for making this motion. I think it addresses the mismatch in timing between taking final action on this amendment ahead of getting those 2022 assessment results. And I also appreciate that this motion is really specific to the criteria that would need to be met in the assessment to trigger the board using this board action specification process. I think I share concerns that Mike raised about waiting until 2024 to take action in response to a poor assessment outcome, just because the longer we wait to take action, the more severe those measures are going to have to be to meet the 2029 deadline. So I support this motion.
Thank you, Megan. And as we go through the queue here, if you're in support or in opposition, in the interest of time, let's try to be as concise as we can and hit our points. Just want to be conscientious of the other subject matter we have to cover and making sure that we end when we are on a 5 o'clock stop. We could go a little bit longer, but I want to try to keep everybody on schedule. So next up is Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And up front, I'll say that I do plan on supporting this motion. I appreciate the intent of it. In particular, I think it makes me feel better about adopting the PDT's recommendation to remove section 4.2.1 from the amendment, the measures to protect the 2015 year class, because this could give us a mechanism for taking quick action after the stock assessment later this year if we get bad news from the assessment and determine that we're not on path for rebuilding. I do have concerns around process, and I don't think we should take it lightly that we're essentially doing away with the normal public comment process we would go through before changing measures. And I would just ask that however this ends up playing out, whatever process we follow, that when candidate measures, if we end up going down this road and there are some potential new measures, that those are provided to the board enough in advance of final action that there's some opportunity for board members, for state agencies to do some level of outreach to the public to get some feedback. I think it would be a really bad outcome if we sort of got the potential suite of measures very quickly before the meeting where we had to take final action and there wasn't time for some level of public comment. And I just also wanted to clarify, based on the language here, I'm seeing that this action is specific to the 2022 stock assessment results. So I just want to clarify that we're not essentially, by putting this in the amendment, adding a new sort of potential tool in the toolbox that the board could avail itself of at any time when we're in a rebuilding and we get a stock assessment that indicates we're not on track for rebuilding. So that, down the road, if unfortunately we get the next stock assessment and it looks like we're off track for rebuilding, this would not mean that we could immediately just use this new specifications process. We would still have to go through the standard addendum process. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. Mike Armstrong, is that your intention to address Justin's last point?
Yes, that would be, this is a one use only thing, unless, down the road we decide to change it. But as of now, we use it once, we may use it once, and that's it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. The next up is Max Appleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I definitely support this concept, the intent behind this for all the reasons that have been said already. And I think I can support the motion, but I want to echo some of the concerns I heard from Justin again with, well, for one, I heard specifications process, which I think is a very new term to this management board, which has already been pointed out. That's not a typical process that we go through for striped bass. And I am concerned about cutting out our normal public comment process, adaptive management process, especially for this fishery. And so I think what might help me be a little more comfortable is really understanding the difference in timeline between something like this and the addendum process. I do recognize that there's going to be some period of time in both processes, whether an addendum or this board action, that requires some TC work. And I think there's a lot of interest in having time for board members to meet with constituents to get their input as well. So are we able to walk through the process here on both sides, from when the assessment results are available to when final measures would be implemented?
Emily, are you able to map that out for Max and answer his question?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So for the addendum process, if the board initiated an addendum in October of this year, 2022, if the PDT developed an addendum and the board approved that addendum for public comment in February of 2023, the public comment period would take place in the spring, and the board could potentially consider final action on that addendum in May of 2023. So by that point, I don't think there would be time for states to implement those regulations for the 2023 season. So that's where that likely implementation in 2024 came from. As far as the motion that's on the board here, I think if this were added to the document and if this were approved by the board in May, I think the board in May could task the TC with calculating or identifying a couple of options for measures to meet the reduction if the stock assessment report indicates a reduction is needed. So I think potentially the TC could provide, concurrently with the assessment results in October of this year, could provide a couple of options for measures that would meet said reduction. I will say that if the board does task the TC with that, it would be helpful for the board to provide, any guidance if possible to the TC, for example, 1 slot limit, 1 minimum size or something like that. And then potentially, depending on, the commission and how things go, maybe there could be some sort of additional special board meeting that could be scheduled, after the October meeting for the board to take final action, so that, as Justin mentioned, maybe there could be some time for the board to process those results and potential options. And then if final action was taken by the board in late 2022 or early 2023, similar to the Addendum 6 process, I think states could potentially get those regulations implemented by April 1, 2023. So I think the difference would be a potential implementation date of April 1, 2023 versus January 1, 2024.
Did that help, Max?
Yeah, it did. Could I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Thank you. So I would agree that it would be very unusual for striped bass measures to change in the middle of the season. What I heard with the addendum process, final action would happen in May, and then it would be sometime after that, maybe a couple months at most, before states could get measures on the books. And that would be unusual to change measures in the middle of the season. Usually we wait till the beginning of the next season to have those changes go into effect. So I would agree that would be unusual, but it's not out of this board's purview to set an implementation deadline like that. And then I guess my follow-up question would be, it sounds like there would be very limited number of options that would be put forward under this specifications process, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but I'm wondering if there would be opportunity after that, considering that this is sort of a stopgap. I think I heard that term used, a stopgap approach, to be a little bit more careful and deliberate about what our more long-term management program would look like under the remaining years of the rebuilding program. Is that something that you envision, the makers of the motion, Mike and J-Mac?
Mike or Jason, can you comment to Max's inquiry?
Sure. Can you say the end of your question again? You broke up on my end.
Yeah, I'm under the impression that if we went through the specifications process, the types of options that would be considered in October or late this year would be limited. There would only be a couple. And again, keeping the typical public comment process in mind, and doing away with that, I wonder if there's still going to be an opportunity after that to go through the commission's adaptive management process to consider a more long-term measures for the remainder of this rebuilding program.
Yeah, I mean, I think the motion is silent on that, but I think the board can do what they want, and I think that could be a route they go.
That answer your question, Max?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm watching the time melt away here a little bit, but this is a really, really important discussion. We have Joe Cimino up next, and before I turn it over to Joe, I just want to mention I do want the public to have some opportunity to react to this. So other board members, if you have something new to add to this discussion, or we haven't heard from you today, certainly by all means raise your hand, and I'll go to Tony after Joe. But I do want to transition at some point over to the public soon. So Joe, it's over to you.
Great, Marty, thanks. I just want to say that I'm in support of this for all the reasons mentioned. I am a little bit surprised by all the concerns, but I'm just going to hope that this motion passes and that we can address some of those in the future. You know, I think a lot of states have a public process in place to deal with the federally managed species. A little surprised by all of Noah's concerns on this, but I'll address that more if this motion passes, and I certainly hope it does. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. So Tony, in the spirit of hopefully folks on the board who haven't had a chance to talk here at the meeting, or if somebody needs to add something to this, I'll ask you one more time if there's any board members that have their hands raised, and then we'll pivot over to the public.
There were a couple of souls that put their hands down, but we still have 3. I have John McMurray, Bill Hyatt, and Emerson Hasbrook.
Okay, I'm going to honor all 3, but John McMurray, no offense to you, I'm going to go ahead and let Bill Hyatt go first, and then Emerson, because they have not had any, we haven't heard from them in this meeting yet, if that's okay. So I'll go to Bill Hyatt first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be quick. I just want to say that I very much support this motion, and I don't really share some of the concerns, maybe not to the degree that others have expressed about loss of opportunity for public input if this is put in place. And I'm not so concerned because of the the specificity of this option, of this motion, and because any application will fall very, very shortly afterwards following the public input that we're going to get on the amendment. So support it and don't have great concerns over not having immediate public input should we need to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'll go to Emerson now.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly support this motion, and this motion is just to get this into the public hearing document. So it's not like we're taking, final action on this component being a final entity in Amendment 7. So let's get it out to the public, and the public will certainly tell us if they would rather have us have the ability to act quickly with not a lot of public input, or go the more traditional route of an addendum that's going to take a little bit longer but provide more public input. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerson. And last but not least, back to you, John McMurray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief because I think Emerson just covered most of what I wanted to cover. The great majority of the public comment up to now has been clear that we need to act sooner rather than later, and this offers a tool in the toolbox to do that. And I think we'll hear a lot of support for it when we go out to public with Amendment 7. So I'm in support, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And Tony, I'm going to go ahead now and we'll swing over to the public. And I think the best way to handle this will be, let's get a show of hands from those folks in the public that would like to make a comment. Based on the number that we receive, we may have to adjust the time allotment, but I'll let you see how many hands go up.
I'm just going to give one more second. And unless I see your hand go up, I'm going to consider we have 4 people. And I'm going to cut it at those 4.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And to save time, I'm going to let you call them if you don't mind in the order that you see fit. And for those 4 public members, if you could keep your message very short, less than a minute or less if possible. Thank you.
Okay, Patrick Paquette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick Paquette, Massachusetts Striped Bass Association, and a member of the AP. I very much appreciate this motion by my home state of Massachusetts. We have been, as a member of the AP, I struggled with the protection for protecting those 3-year classes, because in the back of my head I said the assessment's going to come out and we're going to need a reduction. that seems like that's plain as day to me from looking at all the information that I follow. So I appreciate getting this out to the public now. I believe that this cuts the timeline as explained, and I believe that including it in the draft amendment, I believe that the AP will have the ability to comment on the draft amendment. I know that the organized recreational public has many leaders that are on it and ready to submit letters and organize people to submit letters. So I believe there will be a level of public input. I very much appreciate the ASMFC even considering basically shifting into a faster gear than normal, and I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I appreciate that. Who's next, Tony?
Taylor Vavra.
Go, Taylor.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just very quickly wanted to say that I think, the angling public has made it clear that they want decisive corrective action. And we feel that Mr. Armstrong's motion is consistent with that feedback. And on behalf of our members of Stripers Forever, and given the boundaries outlined by the motion as a one-time measure, that we support this motion and think this is a good move and puts us ahead of the game in some ways. So just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. And who do we have next, Tony?
Charlie Whittick.
Charlie.
Yeah, I feel very comfortable to say that I think I'm speaking for the 3,000 plus people that commented on the public information document last spring and often raised the issue of delay, that this is the kind of decisive, prompt action that we want to see from the management board, and I expect it'll get wide support.
Thank you, Charlie. And I think we have one more, Tony.
Bill Zalzek.
Go ahead, Phil.
Again, Phil, I still haven't been able to hear you, so you are still not connected via audio. I apologize. I think Marty and
I think we've
got to move on.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and move. So Phil, we apologize. We're trying to do everything we can. Maybe we can work with you in the future ahead of time to make sure we can help you out even better. All right, so we'll bring this back to the board. And I'm going to go ahead and, let's give it a try. We'll try to see if we can do this by consent. Is anyone on the board in opposition of this motion?
I have no hands up in opposition.
And the motion passes by consent. All right. And then Emily and Tony, help me, but I think we have two more sections to go through. But before we do that, this was one discussion. I'd like to ask the board if there's any other considerations, discussion, concerns they have related to that particular section, or are we okay to move on? If so, raise your hand. If we don't see any hands, we're going to have Emily move on to the last two sections.
I have Justin Davis followed by Mike Luisi.
Okay, we're not quite there yet then. We're not quite there yet. So Justin, we'll go with you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify at this point, section 4.2.1 is still on the document and would go out for public comment unless we take some action at this point.
Emily, is that accurate?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Unless action is taken, those measures to protect the year classes are still in the document at this point.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, go ahead, Justin.
I would be willing to make a motion to that effect, but I would defer to Mike Louisi first, since he had his hand up, if he's got a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Mike Louisi.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, go ahead. I had the same question, Justin. I wanted to make sure that the PDT's evaluation of section 4.2.1 was discussed. And if you have a motion, I would say go for it. I didn't have one planned, but I did want to discuss where we go with that section. Thanks.
Back to you, Justin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Given that, I would move to remove section 4.2.1, measures to protect strong year classes, recreational size, and bag limits, from Amendment 7.
All right, thank you, Justin, and we'll look for a second.
I have David Borden.
All right, seconded by David Borden. And go ahead, Justin, if you want to provide your rationale.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to keep it brief. I think we've already had a pretty good discussion around this. I agree with the PDT's recommendation that we should remove this from the amendment. It's clear based on the projections that were done that these options will not provide a benefit to stock rebuilding, which was the rationale for taking a look at this. And I certainly can appreciate the rationale for having added this into the amendment and taking a look at this. But given that at this point there's no evidence that these measures will assist us with stock rebuilding, and also the noted challenges around the timing with the stock assessment coming out later this year. Also, given the motion that we just passed for the new process by which the board will have the option to take quick action later this year if we should get a result from the stock assessment that indicates we're not on track for rebuilding, I think at this point I feel pretty safe recommending that we remove this from the document. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. David, as a seconder, do you have anything to add to that?
No, other than I agree with all of Dr. Davis's comments, and I won't reiterate those points. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I remain very sensitive to the public's perspectives, and we've heard a good bit of that captured in the previous dialogue. But I would put it out this way. If there is any members of the public that have strong opposition to this motion, could you please raise your hand? I'd like to hear from you.
I have one member of the public. I'm going to open up your mic. Mike Playa.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mike Playa. I'm on the AP. And I'll reiterate what I said at the AP. Katie's analysis did not show an effect on SSB because she assumed that that F remained the same, and that there was no benefit for having larger, more viable fry. And I think the only way we can be sure about what the impact is on angular effort and catch would be to send this out to the public and hear what they have to say. I'm not saying that it's a bad idea or a good idea. I just want to hear from the public.
All right, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Tony, is there anyone else that raised their hand that has opposition to this?
I had one other individual, and that is Andrew Reichart.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Reichart. I'm from Fly Fishers International. I'm not actually voicing opposition as much as just confusion. I'm a member of the general public and the VP of conservation for our organization, and I'm sort of unclear what this motion would accomplish, and that's just to give you a perspective from the general public, is I think it's a little bit too granular for someone kind of coming in as a layperson to really grasp what this motion would do.
Emily, do you want to take try to attempt to answer Andrew's inquiry just in a broad sense?
Sure, Mr. Chair. So this motion would remove the options that are currently proposed in draft amendment 7 to change the recreational size and bag limits. So the draft amendment currently proposes a couple different options for the ocean and the bay for changing the recreational size and bag limits. And if this motion is approved, those options would be removed from the document, so the public would not have an opportunity to comment on those options, and draft amendment 7 would maintain the current management measures that are in place.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, you're welcome, Andrew. No others, Tony?
No other members of the public. You do have Mike Luisi. And I guess I don't know, Marty, what you want me to do. Now I've had additional members of the public raise their hand. I don't know where.
Yeah, I think we'll. I think we're going to go ahead and bring this back to the board. We are at 4:30, and we still have 2 sections to go. We've had pretty extensive dialogue on it already. So let's tell you what, Mike, go ahead. If you can keep it brief, and then we want to bring this back for a vote, please. Mike Luisi.
Mike, you're self-muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Marty. Mr. Chairman, I had my hand up from before. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I'm sorry. So let's take it back to the board then. Again, I'll try this to see if we have consensus. Is there anyone on the board who is in opposition to this motion? Raise your hand.
Good.
Mike Luisi, your microphone is open.
Request for a 30-second caucus, please.
Okay, Megan. All right, so we'll go with 30-second caucus. You could set the timer, Tony, and we'll come back.
Will do.
Okay, we're back. And thank you, Megan. I didn't mean to be presumptuous. Thank you for asking for that. So I will try now again via consent. Is there any opposition to this motion?
We have one hand up in opposition, the state of Maine.
Okay, so then we have to come back to a formal vote. All right, so Tony, we'll go ahead and call the question. This motion is to remove section 4.2.1, measures to protect strong year classes, recreational size and bag limits from draft amendment 7. Motion by Dr. Davis, second by Mr. Borden. All in favor, please raise your hand.
Just letting the hand settle. I have New Jersey, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Connecticut, NOAA, D.C., District of Columbia, Massachusetts, Maryland, New York, Delaware, Virginia, Rhode Island, North Carolina, and Potomac River Fisheries Commission. I will put the hands down for everybody. I'm ready.
All those opposed to this motion, please raise your hands.
Maine.
Thank you, Tony. I think that's all the votes. Do we need to call for null or abstentions?
I believe you're correct, so no.
All right, thank you. So the motion passes 15-1.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily. All right. So we're still on this particular section. Emily has two more to cover. And I'll just ask the question one more time from this particular section. On the year class options and rebuild, are there any other issues that we need to discuss? Otherwise, we'll move on to the last two items.
I have no additional hands.
All right, thank you, Tony. Megan, I'm sorry, Emily, you are clear to go ahead on these last two sections.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, so these final two sections are section 4.2.2, which is measures to address recreational release mortality, and section 4.6.2, which is conservation equivalency. And as Mr. Chair mentioned, these are the final two sections with proposed options in draft amendment 7 that we have not already covered. So starting with recreational release mortality in the recreational fishery is a large component of annual fishing mortality. It was the largest component from 2017 through 2020. And the striped bass fishery is predominantly recreational, with most of the catch released alive. And as a reminder, the current management program primarily uses bag limits and size limits to constrain harvest and is not designed to control effort. And this makes it difficult to control overall fishing mortality. And efforts to reduce fishing mortality through harvest reductions may be of limited use unless release mortality can be addressed. So there are 4 sets of options in this section, in addition to the option A, which is status quo circle hook requirement that was implemented through Addendum 6. The board could consider one or more of the following types of options to address recreational release mortality. Option B is effort controls, which are seasonal closures. Option C is gear restrictions, and option D is outreach and education. So the status quo option here, option A, is the circle hook requirement implemented through Addendum 6, and this requires circle hooks when fishing recreationally with bait for striped bass. This requirement does not apply to any artificial lure with bait attached. Currently, there is guidance on incidental catch of striped bass as follows. It is recommended that striped bass caught on any unapproved method of take must be returned to the water immediately without unnecessary injury. So option B is seasonal closures, and this could be selected to be implemented along with the status quo option A. And seasonal closures are intended to reduce the number of live releases by reducing the number of fishing trips or effort that interact with striped bass. And the majority of options in the draft amendment are no targeting closure options that were developed by the PDT. And this is in order to address releases resulting from both harvest trips and catch and release fishing trips. Estimating the reduction in removals from a no targeting closure depends on assumptions about changes in angler behavior, and this is highly uncertain. And for future management actions, the PDT recommends that the TC discuss and potentially establish a standardized method for estimating the reduction in removals associated with no targeting closures. As far as the options themselves, option B1 under seasonal closures are state-specific 2-week closures, and these closures would be no targeting closures. So all recreational targeting of striped bass would be prohibited for a minimum of a 2-week period, and this is intended to reduce effort during times when the fishery is active in each state. So under sub-option B1A, each state's closure would need to occur during a wave with at least 15% of the state's annual directed striped bass trips. And that's provided in Table 10 in the draft amendment. And those calculations were based on MRIP directed trip data from 2017 through 2019. Sub-option B1B would require each state's closure to occur during a wave with at least 25% of the state's annual directed striped bass trips. And for these options, CE would not be permitted. And if the board selected one of these closure options under B1, the board would also need to consider Tier 1 listed here to determine whether existing no targeting closures implemented in 2020 through Addendum 6CE would or would not meet the requirements of these new closures. So under option A, those existing no targeting closures implemented in 2020 would fulfill the new closure requirements. Under option B, those existing no targeting closures would not fulfill the requirements. And so those states would need to either implement additional closures or implement the FMP standard size limit. Under option B2, B2 considers spawning closures, and this could be selected in addition to closures under B1 or independent of option B1. And these spawning area closures could contribute to stock rebuilding by eliminating harvest and or reducing releases of spawning and pre-spawn fish. So for these options, existing spawning closures would be applied toward meeting the requirements of whichever sub-option is selected. B2A would require a no harvest closure during wave 1 and wave 2 in spawning areas. B2B would require a no targeting closure for a minimum of 2 weeks on the spawning grounds. So not necessarily the entire spawning area, but on the spawning grounds during a 2-week period in wave 2 or 3 to align with peak spawning in that state. And for these options, again, CE would not be permitted. Moving on to option C, gear restrictions. Again, in addition to the status quo circle hook requirement, the board could consider additional gear restrictions. Option C1 would prohibit the use of any device other than a non-lethal device to remove a striped bass from the water or assist in releasing a striped bass. And the draft amendment does include a definition of a non-lethal device. Option C2 would require that striped bass caught on any unapproved method of take would be returned to the water immediately without necessary injury. As a reminder, this incidental catch provision is currently included as recommended guidance in Addendum 6. So selecting this option under Amendment 7 would make this incidental catch provision a requirement. And then finally, option D is related to outreach and education. States have already implemented outreach and education campaigns related to circle hooks and related to best handling practices as encouraged by Addendum 6. These options are intended to more explicitly recognize those efforts as part of Amendment 7. So D1 would require states to promote best handling practices, and states would be required to provide updates on these outreach efforts in their annual compliance reports. Under D2, it would be recommended that states continue to promote these best handling and release practices. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the Law Enforcement Committee met in December 2021 and briefly discussed these proposed options to address recreational release mortality in Draft Amendment 7, and they noted the following in their discussion. The first is there was concern that no targeting closures would be unenforceable. There was support for making the incidental catch provision a requirement. It was recommended to conduct outreach to manufacturers to continue addressing questions about what qualifies as a circle hook. The LEC noted the overall importance of regulatory consistency, particularly for shared water bodies. And the LEC also noted that any spawning area closures should be clearly defined. So for example, clearly defining whether the closure are in major spawning rivers or minor spawning rivers or both. So I'll move on now to the conservation equivalency options, and then I will pause for questions. So the statement of the problem for the conservation equivalency section notes that there is value in allowing states to implement alternative regulations based on the needs of their fisheries, but this creates regulatory inconsistency among states, and this comes with associated challenges such as enforcement challenges with these regulatory inconsistencies. It's also difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of CE programs once they're implemented due to the challenge of separating the performance of the measures from other variables like changes in angler behavior or changes in fish availability. There have also been some concerns raised that some of the alternative measures implemented through CE could potentially undermine management objectives. And then finally, there is limited guidance on how and when CE should be pursued and how exactly equivalency is defined. So option A is the status quo, and options B through E in this section consider whether to adopt new default restrictions or requirements for the use of CE. And any sub-option selected under B through E would automatically apply to any new FMP standards approved through Amendment 7 and all subsequent management actions and CE proposals. So again, option A is status quo. The board currently has final discretion regarding the use of CE and approval of CE programs, and the board can restrict the use of CE on an ad hoc basis for any FMP requirement. Potential restrictions could include specifying measures that are not applicable for CE, or the board could limit the range of measures that may be proposed through CE. Again, currently the board does have discretion on the use of CE. Option B would establish default restrictions on the use of CE for certain fisheries depending on the status of the stock. So when these stock conditions are met, CE programs would not be approved based on whichever option is selected. And it's important to note here that any previously existing CE programs would remain in place until board action is taken to change those FMP standards. So the first set of sub-options here is B1, and this considers what those restrictions would be. B1A would not allow CE if the stock is overfished. B1B would not allow CE if the stock is below the SSB target. And the board could choose either B1A or B1B. And then in addition to those, or exclusive of those, the board could select B1C, which would not allow CE if overfishing is occurring. So the next set of sub-options, B2, considers the applicability of any restrictions that are selected under B1. So most of the concerns surrounding CE that were identified during the scoping and PID process for Draft Amendment 7 were related to non-quota managed fisheries due to uncertainty in MRIP data and challenges with measuring the effectiveness of CE programs. So at a minimum, any restrictions selected under B1 would apply to non-quota managed recreational fisheries, which would include the Chesapeake Bay trophy fishery. The restrictions would not automatically apply to the Hudson River, the Delaware River, and the Delaware Bay fisheries. Under option B2, the board could choose to extend those default CE restrictions to apply to one or more additional fisheries. So the board could choose to extend those restrictions to the Hudson and Delaware fisheries. The board could extend those restrictions to quota managed recreational fisheries, so extend those restrictions to bonus programs, and or the board could extend those restrictions to apply to commercial fisheries. The next set of options, option C, would establish default precision standards for MRIP catch and effort estimates used in CE proposals. So these options are based on the percent standard error, or PSE, associated with MRIP estimates. C1 would not allow CE proposals to use MRIP data with a PSE exceeding 50. For C2, the PSE could not exceed 40. And for C3, the PSE could not exceed 30. And the next set of sub-options, option D, would establish a default uncertainty buffer for CE proposals for non-quota managed fisheries. So this uncertainty buffer is intended to increase the probability of success in achieving equivalency to the FMP standard. So option D1 would require an uncertainty buffer of 10% for CE programs. D2 would require a buffer of 25%, and D3 would require a buffer of 50%. And then finally, option E considers establishing a definition of what equivalency means for CE proposals for non-quota managed fisheries. So these options are intended to specify the % reduction or liberalization that must be met with a CE proposal in the case where the FMP standard is projected to have different effects at the coast-wide versus the state-specific level. So proposed CE programs would be required to demonstrate equivalency to either option E1, which would be equivalency to the % reduction projected for the FMP standard at the coast-wide level. So for example, this was the requirement for Addendum 6, that each state was required to achieve an 18% reduction, which is the same reduction that was projected coast-wide. Under option E2, proposed CE programs would be required to demonstrate equivalency to the % reduction for the FMP standard projected at the state level. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair, on recreational release mortality and conservation equivalency. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Emily. So we go back to the board and again, emphasizing what our intentions are in terms of whether we're going to leave things as they are or whether we're going to modify the narrative or remove it. We'll now move to questions for Emily and any discussion. We'll start with questions first. So Tony, any board members have questions on these two sections?
I have 2 members with their hands up, John McMurray and Justin Davis. And one more, Emerson Hasbrook.
Okay, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question on the spawning area closures. And the draft isn't clear on what constitutes a spawning area. And I'm sure opinions would vary greatly depending on how far down in the watershed it would go. So I think that it probably should be clear in the document so people know exactly what they're commenting on. I guess where in the process would we clarify that?
Thanks for the question, John. I think perhaps we could potentially reach out to the states. What I will say is that Amendment 6 includes a recommendation for states to implement spawning area closures, and that recommendation in Amendment 6 lists those spawning areas pretty generally, which is how they're listed in Draft Amendment 7. So, I think from the PDT's perspective, we didn't talk about specific boundaries for those closures, more that the states would determine where those spawning areas are to implement those closures.
Does that answer your question, John? You need to follow?
It did, but so there are guidelines or some sort of map in the Amendment 6 recommendations we could direct people to? Is that what I heard?
No, so there's no specific map or specific boundaries listed. Amendment 6 just lists the spawning areas themselves and then left it to the states to determine those exact boundaries. I might turn to Tony if she has any thoughts on, the commission specifying where spawning closure boundaries would be, or if that would be a state decision.
Thanks, Emily. I guess if it were a state decision, we would just need to specify that the state would determine the spawning areas in the document so the public knew that. Otherwise, we would have to define the spawning areas within the document itself. Bob, I don't know if you have another possibility or refer to another document. I mean, we could just take what was in Amendment 7, I guess, and put it into this document. But I'll go to Bob for any other ideas.
Yeah, Marty, I'll chime in. I don't have anything else to add. It just needs to be defined somewhere, either through this document or, leave it up to the states, and the states will have to provide probably a definition for review by the technical committee and the board as a part of their implementation plan, if this option is selected.
John, any last thoughts? Does that answer your question to satisfaction or not?
It does. It doesn't really, to be honest. But you're gonna get a lot of feedback from the public, I'm sure, because they don't. I mean, to tell them what the spawning area closure would be after, they comment on it or after we maybe approve it, I think is not really the right way to go here. But it doesn't sound like there's any good solution, so I'll just leave it at that.
It's an interesting discussion. In the Chesapeake, the spawning rivers, areas, and reaches are pretty well defined by the two states. PRC's jurisdictions defined in Merrill and Comar. I can't speak for other states and other jurisdictions. Emily and Tony, is there, to address John's concern, is that something we can do outside of a motion to try to help clarification for the public, or just trying to see if we can address his concern?
So Tony, I'll just jump in. I think from the PDT perspective, I think, I would propose deferring to the states to define those areas. I don't know if, from Tony's perspective, if those definitions would be in this draft amendment, or if it would be just deferring to the states to implement those closures to, cover the applicable spawning areas.
I think, and to add on to that, Marty, I think what we could do is in the document, we would say for states that have spawning areas defined, those, we would use those spawning areas as defined by the state. For those that do not, if this option were approved, states would have to define those and bring them back to the board as part of their implementation plan.
Yeah, John, does that help a little bit? It seemed to, for me at least, it seemed to add some clarity.
It does. I'm not going to take up any more of the board's time on it.
All right, thank you. And next we'll go to Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, if the board takes final action on this amendment in, let's say, May, and opts to approve one of the options under section 4.2.2, either one of the no targeting closure options or the spawning closure options, and also votes to add the sort of one-time only specifications process to the toolbox, and then we get a not great result from the stock assessment in October and decide to use that specs process, will the potential savings that are going to be achieved through implementation of those no targeting or spawning area closures in 2023, will those need to be taken into account when the technical committee determines what measures are needed to achieve whatever reduction we have to achieve to get back on the rebuilding timeline?
Thanks, Justin. Because there is no standardized method established to calculate the % reductions achieved by no targeting closures at this point, I would assume that those closures may not be incorporated into that calculation of achieving a reduction. Again, I'll defer to Katie if she thinks otherwise, but at this point, I don't anticipate that being possible.
I think it'll be, if we did do it, it would probably be along the lines of something more like a sensitivity analysis because obviously the issue with some of these closures is what happens to all of those trips where fish were released? Do those trips can still happen or not? And so sort of the maximum reduction you would expect is that everybody who released a fish gives up and goes home, or everybody who caught a fish before none of those trips happen. And so versus, everybody just switches to catch and release and it doesn't change effort at all. And so we would probably look at some of the bounds on potential reductions that you would expect to help us understand the full potential of reductions with these measures, and then provide that information to the board to help them assess how conservative or risky they want to be with some of their assumptions about what reductions would be due to these programs, where, again, we don't have a really good way of answering some of these questions.
Justin, or do you have any follow to that, or are you satisfied with your?
Just a quick follow-up. I saw language on a slide that said the TC will need to develop a standardized method for estimating removals achieved by no targeting reductions. So I took that to mean that at some point the TC will need to develop a way to assign a number to what level of removals we can achieve with no targeting closure. So is what being said here that we're just not going to be ready to do that before October 2022, or is it just that we're never really going to be able to do that?
I think it'll probably be, we'll have to see how, especially if the TC is going to be tasked with developing options for board specifications to go to be at the board with the assessment. That would certainly cut into our time to be able to do this by October 2022. But I think there's also the issue of the standardized method may end up just being, here's a range of possible reductions. And so this is to give you a sense of the uncertainty with these rather than here's the right number. I think we would need more data down the line to see how these closures actually impact effort and angler behavior in order to get to something a little more certain down the line.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Katie. All right, so we have one more, Emerson, and I'm going to turn it over to him. But before we do that, we're at 5 o'clock now. So I'd ask other board members, unless your question is really critical, Emerson would be the last question. But if you really do feel like you have a compelling question you need to have answered, go ahead and put your hand up. I'll turn to Tony, and then we'll switch to discussion and see whether or not we're going to have any structural modification or removal of any of the narrative and go from there. So over to you, Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Emily, for the great job you're doing in leading us through this document today. So the question I had is actually relative to the answer or the answers to Justin's question that he just asked. So in the document under section 4.2.2, there's a note, a note on estimating reduction and removals. Estimating the reduction and removals from a non-targeting seasonal closure depends on, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But essentially, it says, or that note says that the PDT recommends the board task the TC to establish such methods in advance of implementation of subsequent management actions. The TC may need guidance from the board on this task. So I'm just wondering when the PDT is looking for the board to task the TC to establish such methods. And as Justin said, is this the way it is now? Is this just going to, it's in the document, but it's going to never be utilized because we don't have a method to estimate the reduction and removals? So when is it that the PDT is looking for the board to task the TC so that this can move forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Emerson. This is Emily. From the PDT's perspective, I think this recommendation was a little bit more long-term in that potentially after Amendment 7 is implemented, for any subsequent addendums, it would be beneficial for the TC to have this discussion about no targeting closures and the estimating the reduction in removals, because, through this amendment, it's clear that there's some board interest and in pursuing no targeting closures as a potential management tool. So coming into Amendment 7, the PDT was not trying to achieve a specific reduction with these Amendment 7 closures. However, the PDT recognized that given the interest in these closures as a management tool, that for any subsequent actions after Amendment 7, it would be beneficial for the TC to have this discussion. And I think, as Katie mentioned, in the near term, I think the focus will be on the assessment. But I think potentially after the assessment, that could be a task for the TC so that any future management actions would have that behind them.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Please, if you can keep it short, Emerson.
Yeah, I'll try to. Thank you. So does that mean if some of the options, and some of the components of option B under 4.2.2, effort control and seasonal closures or seasonal requirements, if those are included in the final adoption of Amendment 7, we're not really going to do anything with those. It's just going to kind of languish until we direct the PDT or we direct the TC to establish some methods in terms of estimating removals. Am I following this correctly? So even if it's in there, we're not going to do anything with it for a while?
So if those, oh, go ahead, Tony, sorry.
I was just going to try to help out on this, Emerson. The PDT's recommendation for these is not specific to getting how much you've removed. They were trying to get at ways to lower rec release mortalities. So there wasn't a specific percentage that we're trying to achieve. So I'm not sure, it doesn't, for this document itself, in essence, it's not like an addendum where you're trying to achieve a certain percent reduction. So it's not necessary for this document, but as Emily said, for future, if you're trying to use it as a tool to achieve a certain reduction, then the TC is going to have to try to figure something out.
Okay, thank you. So the note that's in this amendment about the board tasking the TC to establish such methods is not appropriate at this time. There'll be something in the future.
Yes, I think that task was intended as a task following implementation of Amendment 7.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Emerson. I am aware that one other person, I must have missed it, had his hand raised. It's Dave Sikorsky. I'm going to go ahead and turn it to Dave. That's going to be the last question. And then I'm going to ask the board, if functionally there is a desire to modify or remove any of the narrative and language, let's have that discussion. If there's not, I think we'll be looking to move this to fruition. So I'll go ahead and turn this over to Dave Sikorsky and then come back and ask the question if there's any actual adjustments we want to make. So go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my focus is on figures 4 and 5 under the spawning closure component. And to me, I think there might be a small error on the Maryland piece in December. The season closes in the end of December. It's not a no targeting provision. So that's just a note. And then the request would be consistent with the request from last meeting, which I think fell through the cracks. And it relates to providing the public and the board a better way to show us where fisheries are persecuted on spawning stock fish. And I think this makes sense. And while I recognize this document is largely focused on recreational measures, I think just the simple addition of commercial fisheries on spawning stock fish and how they lay out amongst the year would be really helpful. And mostly because we're looking at a composite F. We're looking at a coastwide stock we're trying to manage and a fishing mortality that's all sources of mortality. And so to me, it's really helpful to understand when these spawning fish are persecuted by a fishery, even not just the recreational one. Thank you. Well, I guess my question is, can that be added?
Thanks, Dave. I think if you could just just give a little bit more clarification of what you're looking for? Are you looking for sort of understanding when the commercial seasons for different states and sort of trying to apply that to when spawning fish are potentially available to the fishery?
Yes. Yeah, spawning stock biomass fish.
Okay. I can follow up with you after the board meeting if that's helpful. As you mentioned, this section is focused on the recreational fishery. Perhaps we can add something additional to the appendix to summarize those commercial seasons, if that would be okay with you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave. So now I'm going to shift this back to discussion and any potential action for this section. And I keep thinking of October 2014 when we were in Mystic, Connecticut, and we had, I think, almost a 10-hour meeting. And I do not aspire to prolong this meeting to a point where everyone is having trouble functioning. So I guess the question now before the board is, you have these two sections, we've gone through it, asked questions. Is there any modifications, deletions? Is there anything structurally that we want to adjust here? And if so, if we want to do that, let's have a discussion and a show of hands. If there's not, then I think maybe we're in a position to bring the amendment to fruition and approve it. But Tony, we'll see if you get a show of hands of any kind that want to adjust anything in these two sections.
I have Roy Miller.
Yes, Roy.
Chair, if I may, very quickly, a correction since David Sikorsky brought it up. If you look on figure 5, under spawning area closures, it shows Delaware Bay as being a spawning area in Delaware. It is not classified as a spawning area in Delaware. The Delaware River is not Delaware Bay. So just a quick correction. Thank you.
No, thank you, Roy. I appreciate that. Tony, did anyone raise their hands to signify that they want to move in a direction to discuss possible modifications?
I have 2 hands, Tom Fody and Emerson Hasbrook.
Okay, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, Marty, I'm not saying that we should discuss this any further. What I'm saying is that we're going out to public hearings. We got a document. We've worked on this document continuously for at least 4 meetings. We should just go ahead, put it to bed, and let it go out. And then, because we're going to discuss this to death when it comes back anyway. So I'm comfortable sending this document as is right now.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And Emerson, did you have another comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I didn't. I was getting a sense that there wasn't going to be any motions here to change these two sections. So I was ready to make a motion to accept this, to send it out to public hearing if you're ready.
I believe, are ready, Emerson. So I will go ahead and allow you to entertain that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the staff have a motion prepared to? Okay, so move to approve draft amendment 7 for public comment as modified today.
Thank you, Emerson. Do we have a second to the motion?
I have Justin Davis.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. You have a motion to approve draft amendment 7 for public comment as modified today. Motion by Mr. Hasbrook, second by Dr. Davis. Tony, is it, do we want to have a full vote on this? Or is it okay to see if we can do this by consent?
You can ask for opposition. It's fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. All right, so I'll ask the question. Is there anyone on the board who is opposed to this motion? Raise their hand.
I have no board members with their hand up. Emerson, your mic is still open, just as a FYI.
Okay, Tony, you said there's no hands up?
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you, board members. The motion passes. Amendment 7 is approved to go out to public comment. So thank you all for your hard work. So we are toward the end. We are at other business. Pardon me. Tony, can you, or Emily, can you hear me?
I can now. You cut out for a second, but go ahead.
Okay, my earbuds died. They ran out of batteries. So, okay, so I think we are at the portion of the agenda for other business. And I do have one thing to say before we adjourn, but is there other business to come before this board today?
I see no hands raised.
Okay, and I would just like to say on behalf, hopefully I can speak for the board and all the folks that I've been interacting with over the last couple of years, to pour a lot of accolades on all the groups that convened together. The work group back in 2020, the plan development team, the technical committee, all that hard work, those many, many meetings. There isn't a single person in the staff and all these groups that doesn't care for the species. And I really believe we're headed in a good direction. We're going to have a good discussion. But I wanted to thank all of those groups that worked so hard to bring this to fruition. And I want to save the best thanks to Emily Franca for all of her hard work. It's been an incredible Herculean job, Emily, and you've just been phenomenal. And so I can't thank you enough. And I think I speak for everyone on the board and the public and participants. So thank you so much, Emily, for all your help. So with that, I don't believe we have any other business to come before this board. I'll seek a motion to adjourn.
Hey, Marty, I do want to just make one quick note, and I echo your comments on the work that all of these committees and commissioners and Emily have all done. I think I threw Emily into the lion's den to an extent as a new staff member right into the middle of this document, and she's really ran with it and has done an excellent job. But I just wanted to note, and we talked a little bit about this at the executive committee, and I think the conversation will carry at the policy board level, just in terms of the time frame for this document. You know, the commission has, under the charter, has specific guidelines that we have to follow in terms of the number of days that the document has to be out before you can conduct a hearing, and then after your last hearing, the number of days that the document has to stay out. And get that, if we get the document out even on Friday, that timeline is going to be tight for the May meeting. And so I just want to make sure I set up some expectations for the board in terms of when you'll receive comment on this. If we stay on the current schedule to have this information come out at the May meeting, there had been discussions about having like a special striped bass board meeting end of May, early June, possibly, depending on all the different documents that get approved this week, and the number of public hearings that we would need to have in order to move all those documents through. But if we stay on the regular schedule, it could be that the information that the board gets will be in pieces. In terms of the public comment on this, it would be almost impossible for us to provide the summary of public comment on the meeting materials. And there is, a high likelihood that a lot of the comments may come at the supplemental materials if this is a typical striped bass document where we receive a lot of comments. So I just wanted to set that expectation up for the board and the public. And, we will work as hard as we can and as best as we can. But there are certain time constraints that we have via the charter.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Tony. And I guess aside from the charter, there's also the complications of the synergy of the other boards, many of which are having public hearings as well, if I'm not mistaken, that aren't going to make that easier as well, I guess. Okay. Is there anything else from staff perspective, Emily, Tony, that we need to mention before we adjourn? We're good?
I don't
Nothing
think
from me.
Okay, thank you. All right, I would seek a motion to adjourn, if somebody would be kind enough to offer that up.
Tom Foti has his hand up.
Motion to adjourn by Tom Foti. Do we have a second?
Cherie Patterson.
Seconded by Cherie. Any, if there's is any opposition to that, raise your hand. None, I'm assuming, Tony. So the meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much for your patience, board and public. This amendment is now approved to go out to public comment, and we look forward to everyone's participation in the process.